Just before dawn on the morning of March 8th, 2026, something unusual happened behind the quiet walls of Kensington Palace. The city was still asleep, the streets outside nearly empty, and the palace grounds wrapped in that strange, fragile silence that exists only in the hours before sunrise. Then a black Jaguar without any royal insignia rolled slowly toward the West Service Gate. It was not part of the official motorcade schedule. No press had been notified. No palace photographer stood waiting to document the departure. Even the mounted police who normally accompany royal vehicles were nowhere in sight. The gate opened briefly, the car slipped through, and within seconds it vanished into the dim London morning. To an ordinary observer, it would have looked like nothing. But inside the palace, the meaning of that car leaving the grounds was understood immediately, because the passenger inside was not a visiting diplomat, a doctor, or a member of the royal family. It was the director of archives for the Crown Estate. His job was not ceremonial. His job was ownership. Every royal property record, every deed, every historical transfer of assets connected to the monarchy ultimately passed through his office. When he traveled personally to a residence in the middle of the night, it usually meant only one thing. Something had gone wrong. And within hours of that silent departure, the first signs of a much larger decision began to ripple through royal circles. Invitations that had already been drafted for the upcoming summer season were quietly revised. Internal event rosters were edited. One particular document circulated between senior staff carried a short, stark instruction. Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie, removed from Royal Ascot attendance list. No explanation accompanied the directive. No public announcement followed. But within the palace hierarchy, the significance was unmistakable. Royal Ascot was not just another engagement on the calendar. For more than a century, it had functioned as one of the most visible symbols of belonging inside the royal institution. The royal enclosure at Ascot represented approval, legitimacy. Being invited there meant that the monarchy still recognized you as part of its public face. Being removed from that list meant something else entirely. At first, a few aides assumed the change might be temporary, perhaps the result of scheduling complications. But as the morning progressed, additional instructions followed. Security credentials connected to the event were quietly deactivated. Seating arrangements were rewritten. Even wardrobe consultations that normally take place months in advance were canceled without explanation. By midday, the internal message had become clear. This was not a scheduling issue. It was a decision, and that decision had been made at the highest level of the institution. For months leading up to that morning, tension inside Buckingham Palace had been quietly building. The monarchy was already navigating a complicated transition period. King Charles III had inherited not only the throne but also a collection of unresolved controversies that had lingered around the edges of the royal family for years. Some of those issues had faded with time, others had not. One in particular refused to disappear: the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein. Years earlier, the connection between Epstein and Prince Andrew had triggered one of the most damaging public relations crises in modern royal history. Investigations, interviews, and legal settlements had pushed Andrew completely out of public life. His military titles had been removed, his official duties stripped away, and his presence at royal events reduced to near invisibility. For a while, it appeared that the scandal might gradually fade into the background. But scandals connected to powerful networks rarely disappear entirely. They linger, they evolve, and sometimes they return when the institution least expects them. During the previous autumn, new financial disclosures circulating through investigative media had raised uncomfortable questions about several private investment partnerships connected indirectly to Andrew's former business circle. None of those reports accused Princess Beatrice or Princess Eugenie of criminal behavior, but the names of several financial intermediaries appeared repeatedly in documents that analysts began linking back to older networks associated with Epstein's circle. Inside the palace, that development triggered immediate concern. Because the modern monarchy operates under a fragile contract with public opinion, royal titles carry enormous prestige, but they also carry scrutiny. Any perception that members of the family are financially entangled with individuals tied to serious criminal investigations creates a reputational risk that can quickly spiral beyond control. At first, King Charles had hoped the situation might resolve quietly. The York sisters had long been regarded as relatively low-profile members of the extended royal family. They were not working royals in the strict sense, but they had often appeared at major ceremonial events and charity functions. In previous years, they had managed to maintain cordial relationships with senior members of the family while pursuing independent professional careers. For a time, it seemed possible that the controversy would fade before reaching the level of a formal palace response. But behind the scenes, another conversation had already begun. Prince William had been watching the situation closely. Unlike previous generations of royal leadership, William had grown up in an era defined by relentless digital scrutiny. He understood that reputational crises no longer unfold slowly over decades. In the modern media environment, a single financial revelation can travel across the world in minutes and reshape public perception overnight. And from William's perspective, the monarchy had already endured enough damage from the earlier phases of the Epstein scandal. Allowing even the possibility of renewed association was not an option he was willing to entertain. In November of the previous year, William quietly proposed a new internal review process designed to evaluate the financial transparency of extended members of the royal family who continue to appear at major public events. The request was framed politely, but its implications were unmistakable. If the monarchy was going to maintain credibility in the modern era, every individual representing the institution needed to meet a clear ethical standard. Most members of the extended royal circle cooperated without hesitation, but the response from the York sisters' financial advisors was slower, more cautious, and at times incomplete. To outside observers, that hesitation might have appeared minor. Inside Buckingham Palace, it looked very different, because in an institution built on public trust, refusing transparency can quickly become as damaging as the scandal itself. And by the first week of March 2026, the situation had escalated far enough that the palace could no longer treat it as a private matter. The quiet departure of that black Jaguar from Kensington Palace was not a routine administrative errand. It was the opening move in a decision that would soon redraw the boundaries of the royal family itself. And by the time the sun rose fully over London that morning, the House of Windsor had already begun preparing for a confrontation that would define the future of the monarchy. For several weeks after the quiet adjustments to the Royal Ascot guest list, nothing was said publicly. The palace continued its routine schedule. Official engagements moved forward. Press briefings remained calm and carefully controlled. To anyone watching from the outside, the monarchy appeared stable. But inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had shifted, because the deeper investigators looked into the financial network surrounding the York family, the clearer it became that the controversy connected to Jeffrey Epstein had never fully disappeared. It had simply changed form. Instead of appearing through direct association, it now surfaced through business intermediaries, investment vehicles, and partnerships that operated far away from the spotlight of royal protocol. None of these connections automatically meant wrongdoing. Wealthy families often interact with the same financial advisors, venture funds, and international investors. But the problem for the monarchy was not legality alone. The problem was perception. The crown does not operate like an ordinary private family. Every association, every investment, and every partnership carries symbolic meaning. The public does not separate the personal life of a royal from the institution itself. When a prince or princess appears beside a controversial figure, that image becomes part of the monarchy's reputation, whether the relationship is personal, professional, or purely accidental. Prince William understood this reality better than most. He had spent years watching how quickly a single photograph or leaked document could ignite a global storm. And in the digital age, those storms did not remain contained inside Britain. They traveled across continents in hours, turning domestic controversies into international scandals. That was why William had pushed for the internal ethics review during the previous autumn. It was not designed to punish anyone. It was meant to prevent another crisis before it began. The request was simple. Members of the extended royal family, who continued to participate in highly visible royal events, would voluntarily submit financial disclosures to an independent ethics panel operating under the oversight of the Privy Council. The panel's role was not to judge personal wealth, but to identify any relationships that might create reputational vulnerabilities for the crown. Most of the extended royal network responded quickly. Several cousins, minor royals, and aristocratic relatives submitted their records without protest. In many cases, the disclosures were brief and routine. The process was meant to reassure the public that the monarchy was adapting to modern expectations of transparency. But when the request reached the offices representing Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the response was complicated. Their advisors initially asked for more time. Then they questioned whether the requirement applied to royals who did not receive direct public funding. After that, they requested clarification about the scope of the audit itself. Each individual delay might have appeared reasonable in isolation, yet taken together, they created a growing sense of unease within the palace. Because time was not the monarchy's ally. Journalists had already begun tracing patterns through corporate registries and investment filings connected to several financial entities operating in Europe and the Middle East. Some of the names appearing in those documents were individuals who had previously appeared on the edges of Andrew's old professional network. None of them had been formally accused of criminal activity, but the associations were enough to create headlines if they were confirmed. And the palace knew that once those headlines appeared, the narrative would be impossible to control. The monarchy had survived many crises throughout its long history, but the Epstein scandal carried a uniquely corrosive quality. It combined wealth, power, secrecy, and the exploitation of vulnerable people. In the public imagination, it represented everything that modern democratic societies distrust about elite privilege. Allowing even a faint echo of that controversy to linger around the royal family risked reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. During the final week of February, the situation escalated further. Sources within the Metropolitan Police confirmed that investigators reviewing documents connected to the broader Epstein financial network had issued requests for background information concerning several individuals who had interacted with Andrew's former business associates. Among the names mentioned in preliminary inquiries were Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. The palace moved quickly to clarify that neither sister had been accused of any crime. They were not suspects in any investigation, but the phrase used by the investigators carried enormous weight. They were considered witnesses of interest. Inside Buckingham Palace, that distinction mattered less than the headlines it could produce. Because the moment police inquiries intersect with royal titles, the story stops being about legal details. It becomes a question of institutional credibility. Senior advisors gathered repeatedly throughout the final days of February to assess the situation. Some argued that the palace should continue supporting the York sisters publicly until the investigation reached a clearer conclusion. Others believed that even a temporary association with an unfolding police inquiry posed too great a risk. Prince William had already made his position clear. The monarchy could not afford to appear hesitant. If the institution wanted to prove that it had learned from past mistakes, it needed to act decisively before public pressure forced its hand. But William was not the person who would deliver the final recommendation. That responsibility belonged to someone whose reputation inside the royal family was built on discipline, loyalty, and an almost uncompromising sense of duty. Princess Anne had spent decades earning a reputation as the most pragmatic member of the royal household. She rarely spoke publicly about internal matters, but when she did, her words carried weight. Within the palace, she was known for approaching problems with the precision of a military officer rather than the sentiment of a family member. When Anne began reviewing the financial documents connected to the York network, she did not rely on assumptions or speculation. She demanded evidence. Within days, she requested corporate filings, investment partnership disclosures, and correspondence between financial advisors that might clarify the scope of the sisters' business relationships. Analysts working with the Privy Council assembled timelines mapping how various companies were linked through shared partners and intermediaries. The emerging picture was complicated. It did not show criminal activity, but it did show opacity. Several investment structures were routed through jurisdictions known for minimal disclosure requirements. Some partnerships included individuals whose previous dealings had drawn scrutiny during earlier phases of the Epstein investigations. None of these facts automatically meant wrongdoing. Yet together they formed a pattern that Anne found impossible to ignore. Because the monarchy was no longer operating in an era where appearances could be dismissed as coincidence, if the public believed the royal family tolerated even indirect connections to scandal, the damage could spread far beyond the individuals involved. And by the time Anne finished reviewing the preliminary dossier, she had reached a conclusion that would soon force the crown into one of the most difficult decisions of King Charles's reign. The meeting took place behind closed doors in one of the smaller council rooms inside Buckingham Palace, a chamber that rarely appeared in photographs, and was used almost exclusively for private consultations between senior members of the royal household. There were no journalists present, no official recorders, and no public statement scheduled afterward. It was the kind of gathering that occurs when the institution is forced to confront something it would rather avoid. Princess Anne arrived carrying a thick folder bound in dark leather. She did not begin with introductions or pleasantries. Anne had never been known for theatrical presentations, and she had no intention of turning the moment into one. Instead, she placed the folder on the polished table in front of King Charles and quietly opened it. Inside were the results of weeks of financial analysis. Charts mapping corporate partnerships, summaries of investment structures, copies of filings pulled from registries in multiple jurisdictions. None of the documents contained a direct accusation. There was no line that read criminal conspiracy, no declaration of illegal activity, but the overall pattern they revealed was troubling enough to command attention. Anne began with a simple explanation. The issue facing the monarchy was not whether Princess Beatrice or Princess Eugenie had broken the law. At that moment, there was no evidence that they had. The problem was the network of associations surrounding the investment vehicles connected to their advisors. Several of the individuals appearing in those financial structures had previously operated inside business circles that overlapped with Prince Andrew's professional contacts from years earlier. In another family, that kind of connection might have been irrelevant. In the royal family, it was explosive. Anne spoke calmly as she outlined the implications. Public confidence in the monarchy depended on the perception that its members operated above the kind of shadowy financial dealings that often surround wealthy elites. If journalists discovered that extended members of the royal household were tied, even indirectly, to individuals linked to the Epstein network, the story would not focus on technical legality. It would focus on moral responsibility. The monarchy had already paid a heavy price for that distinction once before. King Charles listened carefully, occasionally glancing down at the documents in front of him. He had spent his entire life inside the structure of the crown, and he understood how fragile public trust could become when scandal enters the conversation. Yet there was another dimension to the problem that made the decision far more complicated. Beatrice and Eugenie were not distant relatives. They were his nieces. Charles had watched them grow up. He remembered them as children playing on the lawns at Balmoral, young girls running beside their cousins during summer holidays. Whatever financial complications now surrounded them, they remained members of the same family that had stood beside him through decades of public life. That memory made the conversation heavier. For a moment, the room fell silent as Charles considered the pages before him. Finally, he asked the question that had been hovering over the entire investigation. Was there any evidence that the sisters themselves had knowingly engaged in unethical conduct? Anne answered without hesitation, no. But she followed that answer with a sentence that shifted the entire conversation. The issue was no longer limited to what had happened in the past. The issue was what might happen next. If the palace continued allowing the York sisters to appear at major royal events while their financial networks remained opaque, every new revelation uncovered by journalists would land directly on the monarchy itself. The crown would appear either unaware of the risks or unwilling to address them. Neither possibility was acceptable. Anne then turned to another document inside the folder. This one outlined the timeline of the ethics review Prince William had proposed months earlier. The report showed how most members of the extended royal circle had complied with the voluntary transparency request without delay. Their financial records had been reviewed and cleared by independent auditors working under the oversight of the Privy Council. The York sisters were the only significant exception. Their advisors had repeatedly postponed full disclosure, citing privacy concerns and legal complexities related to international partnerships. Each delay might have been defensible in isolation, but taken together they had created the impression that something was being hidden. Anne's conclusion was direct. If the monarchy allowed the situation to continue unresolved, the palace would eventually be forced to react under far worse circumstances. Waiting for journalists or investigators to uncover additional details would transform a manageable internal issue into a public crisis. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair as the implications settled in. He understood what Anne was asking. The crown had two options. It could extend its protection to the York sisters and hope the controversy faded quietly, or it could take preemptive action, creating distance between the institution and the financial networks under scrutiny. The first option preserved family harmony. The second protected the monarchy. The choice seemed simple in theory, yet far more painful in reality. Charles closed the folder and rested his hands on the table. The monarchy had survived wars, political upheavals, and centuries of shifting public attitudes. Its resilience came from the willingness of each generation to adapt when circumstances demanded change. Sometimes that adaptation required sacrifice. The question now was whether the crown was prepared to sacrifice its own relatives in order to maintain credibility. Anne did not push him toward an answer. She simply summarized the final recommendation contained in her report. Until the York sisters submitted complete financial disclosures and independent auditors confirmed that their investment networks carried no reputational risk, they should not represent the monarchy at major public events. The most immediate example of such an event was approaching quickly: Royal Ascot. Removing them from that gathering would send a clear signal that the palace was acting before any external pressure forced its hand. It would demonstrate that the institution had learned from earlier crises and was willing to enforce its own ethical standards. Charles understood the symbolism immediately. Ascot was more than a sporting event. It was a public stage where the monarchy displayed unity and tradition. Excluding two princesses from that setting would be interpreted as a serious institutional decision. But perhaps that was precisely the point. If the monarchy hoped to convince the public that accountability applied equally to every member of the family, it needed to make that principle visible. Charles looked once more at the documents before him, then slowly closed the folder. The decision he was about to make would reshape not only the lives of two young women, but also the internal structure of the royal household itself. And within days, the first signs of that decision would begin appearing quietly across the palace calendar. Once the recommendation from Princess Anne reached the final stage of discussion inside Buckingham Palace, the issue could no longer be treated as an isolated family matter. What had begun as a financial review was now evolving into something far larger, a structural reform of how the monarchy governed itself. Prince William had anticipated this moment. For several years, he had been quietly studying the weaknesses that had allowed previous royal controversies to spiral out of control. The pattern was always similar. A scandal emerged. The palace delayed action while trying to contain the story privately. Eventually, public pressure forced a response, and by that time, the damage to the institution had already multiplied. William believed that model no longer worked. The monarchy existed in a world where every document could be leaked, every financial connection traced, and every rumor amplified across global media within hours. If the crown wanted to survive in that environment, it needed something more durable than tradition and instinct. It needed rules. Not vague expectations about royal behavior, but a clear framework that applied equally to every individual carrying the title of prince or princess. During the winter months, William had been developing precisely such a framework, with the assistance of legal advisors and senior members of the Privy Council. The proposal was known internally as the Royal Standard Conduct Protocol. At first glance, it resembled an ethics code similar to those used by government institutions, but its deeper purpose was far more significant. The protocol was designed to redefine what it meant to belong to the royal family in the modern era. For centuries, the monarchy had operated through tradition rather than formal regulation. Members of the family were expected to behave responsibly, but the boundaries of acceptable conduct were often left undefined. That ambiguity had allowed certain individuals to pursue private business ventures, political associations, or social relationships that later created reputational risks for the crown. The protocol William proposed would eliminate that ambiguity. Under the new framework, every royal who wished to participate in official events or public representation would be required to comply with a set of clearly defined standards. The first pillar of the system was financial transparency. Any royal holding assets above a certain threshold would voluntarily submit to an independent annual ethics audit. The audit would not interfere with private wealth itself, but it would examine the nature of business partnerships, investment vehicles, and corporate affiliations. Its purpose was to identify relationships that might expose the monarchy to scandal or political controversy. The second pillar addressed associations. Members of the royal family would be prohibited from entering financial partnerships or professional collaborations with individuals who were under serious criminal investigation or who had been previously connected to major scandals involving corruption, exploitation, or organized financial misconduct. The rule extended beyond direct interaction. Even indirect involvement through intermediary companies could trigger review. A third pillar focused on neutrality. The monarchy's constitutional role required it to remain politically impartial. In recent years, however, several members of the extended royal network had begun engaging in commercial ventures or social campaigns that blurred the line between personal advocacy and institutional endorsement. Under the new protocol, any royal who wished to pursue such activities would first need to formally separate their work from the crown's representation. But perhaps the most controversial element of William's proposal was the enforcement mechanism. Traditionally, royal discipline had been informal. If a member of the family embarrassed the institution, they might be quietly removed from certain engagements or advised to maintain a lower public profile. These adjustments were rarely codified or explained. The new protocol replaced that ambiguity with a structured system of sanctions. Minor infractions, such as unauthorized appearances or breaches of etiquette, would result in formal reprimands and temporary suspension from public duties. Moderate violations involving financial opacity or ethical concerns would trigger mandatory audits and the suspension of patronages connected to the individual. More serious violations, especially those involving reputational damage to the monarchy, carried far stronger consequences. Individuals could be permanently excluded from royal enclosures at major events, lose access to security resources provided by the crown, and be barred from representing the institution in any public capacity. In the most extreme cases, the protocol even allowed for the removal of royal titles and official status entirely. When William first introduced the proposal, some senior advisors worried that the rules might appear too severe. The monarchy had always balanced discipline with family loyalty. Turning internal expectations into formalized regulations risked creating the impression of a rigid bureaucracy rather than a traditional royal household. But Anne supported the proposal immediately. From her perspective, the monarchy's greatest vulnerability was not harsh discipline but inconsistency. When rules exist only as unwritten traditions, they can be interpreted differently depending on personal relationships and public pressure. That uncertainty invites accusations of favoritism and weakens the institution's authority. A clear protocol solved that problem. It ensured that every member of the royal family understood the expectations placed upon them before controversy ever emerged. By the time King Charles finished reviewing the framework, he recognized that the proposal represented more than a response to the York situation. It was a blueprint for the future of the monarchy itself. The crown could no longer rely solely on historical prestige to maintain public confidence. It needed to demonstrate that privilege carried responsibility, and that responsibility was enforceable. Within days of the private meeting where Anne delivered her financial dossier, Charles authorized the first stage of the protocol's implementation. The decision was not announced through a dramatic press conference. Instead, it appeared quietly through administrative changes inside the royal calendar. And the very first test of this new system would be the same decision already unfolding behind the scenes: the removal of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie from Royal Ascot. What once might have been treated as a discreet family adjustment had now become something else entirely. It was the first visible application of a new royal order. Royal Ascot has always been more than a horse racing event. For the British monarchy, it functions as a public ritual, a carefully choreographed display of hierarchy, tradition, and belonging. The royal enclosure, positioned at the center of the racecourse, is not merely a seating section. It is a stage on which the royal family presents itself to the nation and, by extension, to the world. Every appearance there carries symbolic meaning. Invitations to the enclosure are tightly controlled. Members of the royal family arrive together, walking across the grounds in full view of the crowds and the press. Their presence signals continuity. It tells the public that the monarchy remains unified, confident, and stable. For generations, Ascot has served as one of the clearest visual indicators of who truly stands inside the royal circle. That is why the decision to remove Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie from the attendance list carried such weight. It was not merely a logistical adjustment, it was a statement. Inside the palace, staff understood immediately what that statement meant. Once the Royal Standard Conduct Protocol had been approved, the palace needed to demonstrate that the rules would not remain theoretical. They had to be applied in a visible way. Otherwise, the public would dismiss them as symbolic gestures with no real authority behind them. Royal Ascot provided the perfect moment. The event attracts enormous media attention each year. Cameras track every arrival, every conversation, every detail of fashion and ceremony. If the York sisters appeared in the royal enclosure while questions about their financial networks were still circulating, the press would inevitably frame the event as evidence that the monarchy had learned nothing from previous scandals. The palace could not allow that narrative to take hold. By quietly removing the sisters from the invitation list months before the event, the crown avoided a far more damaging scenario. Instead of reacting under pressure, it acted first. The decision would become part of the story, rather than a desperate response to it. Behind the scenes, the implementation unfolded with meticulous care. Royal event coordinators began rewriting seating arrangements. Guest lists were updated. Fashion houses that normally prepare attire for the York sisters during Ascot Week received polite notices that their services would not be required this season. Security officers responsible for managing the royal enclosure updated credential systems to reflect the revised access permissions. Each change was small on its own. Together, they formed a quiet but unmistakable boundary. Word of the adjustment spread gradually through aristocratic circles long before any official acknowledgement emerged. Members of Britain's upper social world tend to hear such news quickly, and the absence of the York sisters from Ascot preparations became an open secret weeks before journalists began confirming it. Reactions varied. Some observers expressed sympathy for Beatrice and Eugenie. They argued that the sisters were being punished for controversies connected to their father, rather than their own actions. From this perspective, the decision appeared harsh, even unfair. Neither princess had been accused of criminal wrongdoing, and both had spent years attempting to build independent careers away from the public drama surrounding Prince Andrew. Others saw the situation differently. To them, the monarchy's responsibility extended beyond personal fairness. The institution itself had endured enormous reputational damage during the earlier phases of the Epstein scandal. Trust had been shaken not only inside Britain, but across the Commonwealth and among international audiences who followed royal affairs closely. If the palace wanted to restore credibility, it needed to demonstrate that no member of the family was exempt from scrutiny. Royal Ascot therefore became a symbol of something larger than a single event. By excluding the York sisters, the monarchy was sending a message to every corner of the extended royal network. Titles alone would no longer guarantee access to the most visible stages of royal life. Participation in those moments now required compliance with the ethical standards laid out in the new protocol. In effect, the crown was redefining membership in the royal institution. Where previous generations had relied on tradition and personal relationships, the new framework demanded accountability. Appearances beside the sovereign were no longer treated as automatic privileges tied to birth. They were conditional responsibilities tied to conduct. The symbolism of the Ascot decision also served another purpose. It created distance between the future of the monarchy and the controversies of the past. The York era, which had been shaped by decades of social prominence and complicated financial ventures, was quietly receding. In its place, a new generation was beginning to take center stage. That transition would soon become even more visible, because while two princesses stepped away from the royal enclosure, another figure was preparing to return to it. For more than 2 years, the Princess of Wales had remained largely absent from public life while undergoing treatment for a serious illness. Her recovery had been followed closely by millions who admired her calm resilience during one of the most difficult periods faced by the royal family in recent memory. Now the palace was preparing to confirm that she would appear at Royal Ascot alongside King Charles. The contrast could not have been clearer. As the York sisters withdrew from the spotlight under the weight of unresolved financial questions, Catherine's return represented stability, dedication, and continuity. The stage that once symbolized royal privilege was about to become the setting for a different narrative, a monarchy reshaping itself in real time. While the palace quietly prepared for the symbolic reset that would unfold at Royal Ascot, another chapter of the story continued to develop far from the public ceremonies of the royal calendar. At the center of that chapter remained the figure whose past decisions had set the entire crisis in motion, Prince Andrew. By the time the decisions regarding the York sisters were finalized, Andrew's role within the royal institution had already been reduced to almost nothing. The titles and privileges that once defined his position had gradually disappeared over the course of several years. Military patronages were withdrawn, official duties ended, public appearances became rare and tightly controlled. Inside palace correspondence, a subtle but meaningful shift had even occurred in the way he was referenced. Increasingly, internal documents no longer used the title Prince. Instead, they referred to him by the formal civilian name used in legal records, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It was a small change in language, yet within the royal household it carried enormous symbolic weight. Titles in the monarchy are not simply decorative labels. They represent the connection between the individual and the institution itself. Removing that designation signaled that Andrew's relationship with the crown had been fundamentally altered. The consequences of that alteration were visible in his daily life. Royal Lodge, the residence he continued to occupy within the Windsor estate, had gradually become a place of isolation. Security officers remained stationed around the property, but their presence was no longer ceremonial. Access to the grounds was tightly controlled, visitors were limited, and the atmosphere surrounding the house had grown noticeably quieter. People who once moved easily through Andrew's social world now kept their distance. In previous decades, he had enjoyed the kind of international network that often surrounds powerful royal figures. Wealthy entrepreneurs, diplomats, and social elites had treated his presence as an opportunity for influence and connection. Those relationships had once formed the foundation of Andrew's public identity. But scandals have a way of dissolving such networks. Once the Epstein controversy reached global attention, many of the individuals who had previously appeared beside Andrew in business or social settings disappeared from view. Invitations stopped arriving. Partnerships dissolved. The world that had once seemed stable began to collapse around him piece by piece. For a time, Andrew resisted that reality. According to sources familiar with the situation, he spent months insisting that the public would eventually recognize the accusations against him as exaggerated or misunderstood. He believed that if he continued defending himself through legal channels and carefully managed interviews, his reputation might recover. But that recovery never arrived. Instead, each attempt to restore his public standing seemed to deepen the damage. Interviews that were intended to clarify his position often raised additional questions. Legal settlements designed to close controversies created new headlines. The more he tried to regain control of the narrative, the more the story slipped beyond his influence. By the middle of the current decade, the palace had reached a difficult conclusion. Andrew could no longer be treated as a temporary public relations challenge. He had become a permanent reputational liability. For King Charles, that realization carried enormous emotional weight. Andrew was not merely another member of the extended royal family. He was Charles's younger brother, someone who had shared childhood memories inside the same historic walls, someone who had stood beside him through decades of royal duty. Yet the monarchy cannot operate solely on the basis of personal loyalty. Its survival depends on public confidence, and public confidence depends on accountability. If the crown appeared willing to overlook the actions of one of its own, critics would quickly question whether the institution was capable of policing itself at all. That reality became even more urgent as investigators continued examining the financial networks connected to Andrew's former professional circles. Each new revelation risked pulling the monarchy back into a controversy it had struggled for years to contain. The possibility that the York sisters might still be interacting with individuals tied to that network only intensified the urgency. From the palace's perspective, the solution was not revenge or punishment. It was separation. By creating clear distance between Andrew and the public-facing elements of the royal institution, the crown hoped to prevent the scandal from contaminating the next generation. The monarchy had already endured enough damage during the earlier phases of the crisis. Allowing the story to follow William's future reign would threaten the stability of the entire transition. In practical terms, that meant Andrew's world continued shrinking. His appearances in Windsor were limited mostly to private family moments away from cameras. Communications with palace officials occurred through formal channels rather than casual conversation. Even routine administrative matters related to his residence were handled with greater oversight than in previous years. To outside observers, the situation might have appeared tragic, and in a purely human sense, it was. Few people experienced the collapse of status and reputation as dramatically as someone who once stood near the center of a centuries-old monarchy. But inside the palace, the perspective was different. The institution had concluded that Andrew's personal downfall was the inevitable result of choices he had made long before the crisis reached public view. The crown could offer sympathy as a family, but it could not allow that sympathy to shape its institutional decisions. The York chapter of the royal story was therefore approaching its final stage. Andrew's influence had faded, his daughters were stepping away from the most visible royal events, and a new structure of accountability was taking shape under the leadership of the next generation. What remained now was to demonstrate that the monarchy itself had learned from the turmoil, and the most visible stage for that demonstration was approaching quickly. As the decisions surrounding the York family quietly took shape behind palace walls, attention inside the monarchy gradually shifted toward the future rather than the past. The purpose of the new reforms was never simply to resolve one scandal. It was to ensure that the institution itself could move forward with a clearer structure of accountability. For Prince William, that objective had become central to his vision of what the monarchy must become in the modern era. Throughout his life, he had watched how fragile public trust could be. The royal family operates in a unique space within society. It carries immense symbolic authority, yet it has no direct political power to enforce that authority. The crown survives because the public chooses to believe in the value of the institution. Once that belief begins to weaken, the foundation beneath the monarchy can erode quickly. William understood that the controversies surrounding Prince Andrew had tested that foundation in ways few royal crises had before. The scandal had crossed national borders, ignited international media scrutiny, and forced the palace into years of defensive explanations. Even after Andrew's removal from public duties, the questions surrounding the royal family's judgment had continued to linger. That was precisely the situation William wanted to prevent from repeating itself. The Royal Standard Conduct Protocol he had helped design was not simply a disciplinary tool. It was intended to reshape the culture of the royal household. Under the new framework, belonging to the institution required more than heritage. It required cooperation with the ethical standards that protected the monarchy's credibility. This philosophy represented a quiet but important shift. For centuries, the royal family had operated as a network of relatives bound together by tradition and ceremony. Personal relationships often influenced how responsibilities were distributed and how problems were handled. When difficulties arose, they were usually managed privately through conversations rather than formal rules. The modern environment no longer allowed that flexibility. Digital media had created a world where every decision could be dissected instantly by millions of observers. Ambiguity, once useful for preserving royal privacy, now created suspicion. If the palace appeared inconsistent or hesitant, critics quickly interpreted that hesitation as evidence of hidden favoritism. William believed the monarchy had to eliminate that ambiguity. By establishing clear expectations for financial transparency, professional conduct, and public representation, the crown could demonstrate that royal privilege came with measurable obligations. The public might not know every detail of the protocol, but they would understand its message. The royal family was no longer above scrutiny. Princess Anne's role in this transformation had been equally significant. Her decades of service had given her a reputation for discipline that few members of the royal family could match. Where William brought generational perspective, Anne brought institutional memory. She had seen the monarchy navigate previous crises and understood how easily small misjudgments could grow into public disasters. Together, their partnership created an unusual balance. William provided the long-term vision for a monarchy adapted to the realities of modern media. Anne ensured that the reforms were implemented with the precision and authority required to make them effective. King Charles, for his part, recognized that the transition was inevitable. Although his instinct often leaned toward preserving family unity, he also understood that the monarchy could not survive by protecting personal relationships at the expense of institutional integrity. The crown had endured precisely because each generation eventually accepted the necessity of change. The decisions regarding the York sisters therefore became more than a response to financial questions. They became the first visible demonstration of a new governing philosophy. Under the emerging structure, royal status would no longer function as a permanent shield against consequences. Instead, it would operate more like a public trust. Those who represented the monarchy would be expected to maintain standards that reflected the responsibilities attached to their position. If they could not meet those standards, they would step aside. That principle was about to become visible to the world, because the next major event on the royal calendar was approaching, and it would place the new direction of the monarchy directly in front of millions of observers. Royal Ascot was no longer just a celebration of tradition. It was about to become a stage for the beginning of a different era. As the summer season approached, the significance of the decisions made inside Buckingham Palace began to crystallize. What had started as a quiet internal review of financial associations had gradually expanded into something much larger. The monarchy was redefining the boundaries of who could stand beside the crown and under what conditions that privilege would be granted. Royal Ascot would soon become the first public demonstration of that transformation. For generations, the event had served as a pageant of royal continuity. The arrival of the sovereign and members of the royal family signaled stability, elegance, and tradition. Crowds gathered along the procession route not simply to watch horse racing, but to witness the symbolic unity of the House of Windsor. But this year, the meaning of that unity had changed. The absence of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie would not go unnoticed. Observers familiar with the social rituals of the royal calendar would immediately recognize the gap. Two figures who had once moved comfortably within the royal enclosure would no longer appear there, and that absence would speak as loudly as any official announcement. For the palace, the decision represented a calculated moment of institutional clarity. Instead of allowing controversy to linger in the background, the monarchy had chosen to draw a visible line. Membership in the public heaven-facing royal family was no longer automatic. It depended on a willingness to operate within the standards now expected of anyone who represented the crown. In practical terms, the change marked the end of an era. For decades, the extended royal network had functioned with considerable flexibility. Cousins, siblings, and distant relatives often appeared at major events, regardless of whether they held formal responsibilities within the monarchy. The arrangement reflected the idea that the royal family was, at its core, still a family. The new approach shifted that balance. Under the framework taking shape around Prince William and Princess Anne, the institution would increasingly distinguish between those who carried out official duties and those who lived privately beyond the central structure of the monarchy. Participation in the most visible ceremonies would become a reflection of accountability rather than ancestry. This transition did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader effort to stabilize the monarchy during a moment of generational change. King Charles had inherited the throne during a period when public attitudes toward institutions were evolving rapidly. Trust in authority could no longer be assumed. It had to be earned repeatedly through transparency and responsible leadership. By supporting the reforms proposed by William and reinforced by Anne, Charles was signaling that the monarchy understood the challenge it faced. The crown was not immune to the standards applied to the rest of society. If anything, it needed to exceed them. At the same time, the palace recognized that reform alone could not sustain the monarchy's future. The institution also needed figures who could embody its ideals in the eyes of the public. That role increasingly belonged to the next generation. The return of the Princess of Wales to Royal Ascot alongside the king would provide exactly that image. After a long period away from public engagements while recovering from illness, Catherine's appearance represented resilience, duty, and continuity. Her presence offered a reminder that the monarchy's purpose extended beyond controversy or internal discipline. It remained at its best, a symbol of service. The contrast unfolding at Ascot would therefore tell a larger story. On one side stood the consequences of past decisions, represented by the quiet withdrawal of the York sisters from the royal stage. On the other stood the emergence of a new structure built around accountability, responsibility, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the House of Windsor, the moment marked a turning point. The institution had faced the shadow of its own internal vulnerabilities and chosen to confront them directly. By enforcing standards that applied to every member of the family, the monarchy was attempting to rebuild the trust that had been tested during years of scandal. Whether that effort would succeed remained to be seen, but one reality was already clear. The future of the crown would no longer be shaped solely by tradition or inheritance. It would depend on the willingness of those who carried its titles to meet the expectations that came with them. And the events unfolding in the summer of 2026 would be remembered as the moment when that new era began. The most powerful message Queen Elizabeth ever left was never delivered from a balcony, never broadcast in a Christmas speech, and never written into a public decree. It was quiet, private, sealed. And yet, it may reveal more about the future of the British royal family than any speech she gave during her 70-year reign. When Queen Elizabeth passed away at Balmoral in September 2022, the world focused on ceremony, the gun salutes, the long queue in London, the solemn procession through ancient streets. But while the cameras were fixed on ritual, something far more intimate was unfolding behind palace walls, a private will, a personal decision, a choice that did not have to satisfy Parliament, public opinion, or political strategy. And in that choice, she selected Lady Louise Windsor, not the future king, not the queen consort, not one of the most senior working royals, Lady Louise. At first glance, the inheritance sounds simple. A cottage within the Balmoral estate, a peaceful residence tucked inside the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by forests, moorland, and open sky. But Balmoral is not just another royal property. It is not owned by the crown. It does not belong to the state. It has been privately held by the monarch since Queen Victoria and Prince Albert purchased it in 1852. That detail changes everything. Balmoral was Elizabeth's sanctuary. It was where she went to breathe, where she rode horses, where she walked her dogs without ceremony, where she could exist not as a sovereign, but as a wife, mother, and grandmother. It was the only place where the monarchy softened into family, and it is also where she took her final breath. To leave a part of Balmoral to someone is not a casual gesture. It is not a symbolic ribbon cutting. It is deeply personal. You do not divide your refuge unless you are certain about who belongs inside it. That is why this story matters. Because this was not an official redistribution of titles. It was not a constitutional maneuver. It was a private act, and private acts often speak louder than public ones. Lady Louise Windsor has never chased headlines. Born prematurely in November 2003, weighing just 4 pounds, her entrance into the world was quiet and medically fragile. She grew up away from the spotlight, under the steady guidance of Prince Edward and Sophie, who built their family life deliberately outside the noise that often surrounds the senior line. When Louise had the option to be styled as Her Royal Highness Princess Louise, she did not embrace it publicly. She became Lady Louise instead. She chose discretion over elevation. She chose a lower profile in an institution that can magnify even the smallest gesture. That choice did not go unnoticed. In a family that has endured interviews, memoirs, public grievances, and televised fractures, silence carries weight, loyalty carries weight, restraint carries weight. And Queen Elizabeth understood weight better than anyone. In her later years, she watched the monarchy strain under pressure. She saw relationships fracture. She saw trust tested. She saw how quickly public narrative could shift. Through all of it, Louise remained steady. No interviews, no commentary, no commercial ventures. Just study, family, and a quiet dedication to the traditions her grandfather loved. When Prince Philip passed away in April 2021, one of the most striking images was not a speech, but a carriage. 17-year-old Louise driving the Duke of Edinburgh's carriage in tribute. She did not do it for spectacle. She did it because he had taught her, because it mattered to him, because she did not want his place to sit empty. That image lingered. Queen Elizabeth saw that too. A monarch's will is sealed for decades. In the United Kingdom, senior royal wills remain private to protect institutional dignity. We will not read the pages, we will not see the signatures. But throughout her reign, Elizabeth communicated through action, through invitation, through proximity, through who stood beside her when moments mattered. And in the end, she left part of her most cherished place to Louise. Then came the unexpected layer. After Elizabeth's passing, The Balmoral estate transferred into the hands of King Charles. Control shifted, authority shifted. Yet sources suggest that Prince William took steps to ensure Louise's inheritance moved forward without friction. That detail matters, because William is not merely a supportive cousin. He is the future king. Every action he takes now reflects the structure he intends to build later. When he protects someone quiet, someone loyal, someone aligned with tradition, he is not only honoring the past, he is shaping the future. And not everyone appears to be inside that emerging circle. This is why a cottage in Scotland is not simply a cottage. It is a signal, a placement, a message about who embodies the values Elizabeth guarded for 7 decades. The will may be sealed for 90 years, but the choice was visible the moment it was made. And sometimes, in the monarchy, silence says everything. To understand why this inheritance carries emotional weight, you have to understand Balmoral not as a postcard castle in the Scottish Highlands, but as the only place where Queen Elizabeth was not entirely the queen. Balmoral Castle sits in Aberdeenshire, surrounded by roughly 50,000 acres of rugged landscape, heather-covered moorland, pine forests, rolling hills, and cold, clear rivers cutting through the land. It is beautiful, yes, but more importantly, it is private. And in the life of a monarch, privacy is rarer than jewels. Unlike Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, Balmoral does not belong to the state. It was purchased in 1852 by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert with their own personal funds. That distinction is critical. It means Balmoral has always existed outside the machinery of government. It is not tied to parliamentary funding. It is not bound by constitutional symbolism. It is family property. For Queen Elizabeth, Balmoral was freedom. Every summer, the royal family retreated there. Official schedules softened, public engagements thinned, formal dress codes relaxed. At Balmoral, Elizabeth wore headscarves and boots, not tiaras. She walked her dogs across open fields. She drove herself across gravel roads. She hosted informal barbecues instead of state banquets. It was the closest the monarchy ever came to normality. That is why the location of her death in September 2022 felt almost poetic. She did not pass away in the center of power. She passed in her sanctuary. Now, consider this. If you had one place on earth that allowed you to step out of duty and simply exist, who would you trust with a piece of it? A political ally? A necessary public partner? Or someone who embodied the values that place represented? Balmoral was never about hierarchy. It was about belonging. Over the years, royal observers noted subtle patterns. Who was invited frequently? Who stayed longer? Who appeared in photographs walking beside the Queen along the estate's quiet paths? Balmoral was where relationships were revealed without press releases. Prince Edward and Sophie were often present in her later years. Their visits were steady, uncontroversial, and unpublicized. Their children, including Lady Louise, grew up with Balmoral, not as spectacle, but as familiarity. Louise did not arrive there as a public figure. She arrived as a granddaughter. That distinction matters. Inside the gates of Balmoral, the monarchy sheds layers. Titles soften. Protocol relaxes. What remains is character. Elizabeth valued discretion. She valued consistency. She valued those who did not weaponize proximity for personal leverage. Balmoral was the testing ground of those qualities. When Prince Philip was alive, he and Elizabeth spent extended periods there. It was where he pursued carriage driving across open land, where he designed improvements to the estate, where he could escape the rigid expectations of palace life. After his passing in April 2021, Balmoral became even more reflective, more intimate. Louise's connection to Philip through carriage driving was not ceremonial. It was learned on that land. Hours spent practicing, conversations away from cameras, shared silence. The estate carries memory. That is why an inherited cottage inside its grounds is not simply real estate. It is entry into a private circle of memory. There are multiple residences within the Balmoral grounds. Cragowen Lodge has historically been used by members of the family before the main summer season begins. Smaller cottages provide accommodation for relatives and trusted guests. Each one exists within walking distance of the castle, but far enough to maintain personal space. To grant one of these properties is to say, you are part of this core. It is easy to underestimate this gesture because it lacks spectacle. There was no televised announcement, no balcony appearance, no formal investiture, but quiet decisions often reveal priorities that public ceremonies obscure. And there is another layer. When Queen Elizabeth's estate passed to King Charles upon her death, legal ownership of Balmoral shifted, yet the emotional architecture of the place remained tied to her memory. Any continuation of her private wishes required alignment among senior family members. This is where the inheritance becomes more than sentimental. It becomes structural, because Balmoral represents continuity. The British monarchy survives not only through constitutional order, but through carefully maintained internal cohesion. Who gathers at Balmoral signals who is trusted. Who is trusted signals who influences the future tone of the institution. In recent years, the monarchy has faced fractures, public interviews, memoirs, legal battles, reputation management. Against that backdrop, Balmoral has remained a constant, a place untouched by commercial narrative. To position Lady Louise within that landscape is to position her within stability. And stability is currency inside a constitutional monarchy navigating modern scrutiny. There is also symbolism in generational transition. Queen Victoria purchased Balmoral. Elizabeth preserved it. Charles now holds it. The estate carries dynastic continuity. Each generation imprints its values upon it. If Elizabeth chose to place Louise within that continuity, it suggests she saw in her something aligned with that lineage. Not loud ambition, not strategic alliance, but steadiness. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the inheritance. Balmoral is not where the monarchy performs. It is where it remembers who it is. To receive a piece of that world is to be told, without fanfare, you belong here. And in a family defined by both privilege and pressure, belonging may be the rarest gift of all. If Balmoral represents belonging, then Lady Louise Windsor represents the kind of belonging Queen Elizabeth quietly protected. To understand why this inheritance carries emotional resonance, we have to look beyond property and into character. Because in royal families, character is often revealed not through grand gestures, but through the absence of noise. Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was born in November 2003, 8 weeks prematurely. Her birth was not a grand spectacle, it was a medical emergency. Delivered via cesarean section at Frimley Park Hospital, she weighed just 4 pounds. For hours, there was uncertainty. The palace did not immediately issue triumphant announcements. Instead, updates were cautious. Both mother and child needed stability before celebration. That beginning matters. Louise's life did not begin with public fanfare. It began with fragility. Within her first year, she underwent surgery to correct esotropia, a condition in which one eye turns inward. The procedure was necessary, delicate, and quietly handled. There were no media tours, no staged family portraits to capitalize on sympathy. From the beginning, her life was shielded rather than showcased. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, built their household deliberately outside the glare that surrounds the direct line of succession. Edward, the youngest sibling of King Charles, has often been described as steady and understated. Sophie, particularly in the later years of Queen Elizabeth's life, became one of the monarch's closest confidantes. Their family rhythm was consistent: low-profile engagements, strong internal loyalty, minimal public controversy. Louise grew up inside that environment. When she was eligible to be styled as Her Royal Highness Princess Louise, she did not publicly adopt the title. Instead, she remained Lady Louise. It was not a dramatic rejection. It was simply continuity with how she had always lived. No escalation, no repositioning. In an institution where titles carry weight and visibility can be leveraged, choosing restraint is not insignificant. She attended school without cultivating public celebrity. She does not maintain official social media accounts. She has not given interviews defining her personal narrative. When she appears at major royal events, she does so without theatrics. She stands composed, observant, present. For Queen Elizabeth, who spent decades navigating the delicate balance between public role and private self, that composure would not have gone unnoticed. But perhaps the most revealing dimension of Louise's character emerged through her relationship with Prince Philip. The Duke of Edinburgh was famously direct, often reserved, and deeply committed to discipline. He had little patience for performance without substance. In his later years, he devoted significant time to carriage driving, a sport requiring concentration, control, and calm under pressure. He personally taught Louise. Those lessons were not symbolic. They were practical. Hours spent across open ground at Balmoral, precision handling of reins, understanding the horses, reading terrain. It was not glamorous work. It required patience. When Prince Philip passed away in April 2021, the world watched a carefully orchestrated funeral under pandemic restrictions. Family members were spaced apart, ceremony was stripped back, yet one image cut through the formality: Louise driving Philip's carriage as part of the tribute procession. She was 17. She did not give a speech. She did not seek attention. She honored him in the language he had taught her, through action. That moment encapsulated something essential: loyalty expressed through continuity. In a monarchy that has endured public ruptures, loyalty is not abstract, it is measured. In recent years, the royal family has faced interviews that pulled private conversations into global circulation, memoirs that detailed internal tensions, legal disputes that exposed internal fractures. Each event chipped at the aura of cohesion that once defined the institution. Against that backdrop, Louise remained unchanged. She did not defend. She did not counterattack. She did not reposition herself for sympathy. She continued her studies, eventually enrolling at the University of St. Andrews, the same university where Prince William met Catherine. It was a subtle but symbolic choice, aligning education with continuity rather than disruption. Elizabeth valued continuity above almost all else. Throughout her 70-year reign, she rewarded those who preserved institutional dignity. Invitations to Balmoral were never random. Seating arrangements at services were not accidental. Jewelry gifts carried meaning. Presents conveyed trust. Louise was present, not at the center of political maneuvering, not in the headlines, but present in the spaces that mattered to Elizabeth personally. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from senior royal duties in early 2020, the monarchy faced a moment of recalibration. Sophie and Edward quietly stepped forward, assuming additional responsibilities without complaint. Their family's reliability increased in visibility, and with that visibility came proximity to the Queen. Louise was part of that orbit. It is tempting to interpret inheritance solely as favoritism, but in royal dynamics, it often reflects value alignment. Elizabeth's world was shaped by duty, restraint, and an almost unwavering commitment to discretion. She rarely articulated her internal emotions publicly. Instead, she communicated through gesture. If she chose to leave part of her most cherished estate to Louise, it suggests recognition, not of ambition, not of strategic advantage, but of character consistent with her own. There is also generational symbolism at play. Louise represents a branch of the family not defined by scandal, not central to succession tension, and not burdened by public polarization. She exists slightly adjacent to the throne, yet fully inside the family fabric. That position grants flexibility without threatening hierarchy. For a monarch who understood the dangers of imbalance, that balance would matter. Louise is not loud. She is not divisive. She does not test institutional boundaries. In a family where visibility can fracture unity, quiet steadiness becomes powerful. Queen Elizabeth spent a lifetime protecting the monarchy from collapse through controlled evolution. She adapted without appearing to bend. She modernized without surrendering core values. In Louise, she may have seen a future custodian of that subtle equilibrium, not someone who would dominate headlines, but someone who would preserve tone, and in the language of royal legacy, tone is everything. If Queen Elizabeth's choice revealed her private values, then Prince William's response revealed something just as important: the direction of the monarchy's future. When Elizabeth passed away in September 2022, a constitutional shift occurred instantly. Balmoral, as part of her personal estate, transferred to King Charles. Ownership changed hands. Authority consolidated. On paper, the transition was seamless. But within any royal household, paper is only half the story. Because inheritance inside a dynasty is never just legal, it is relational. For Lady Louise to retain a cottage within the Balmoral grounds under the new reign, alignment among senior figures mattered. King Charles now held the estate. Decisions regarding its use, maintenance, and access rested with him. And yet, according to palace reporting, Prince William took an active interest in ensuring that Louise's position was respected. That detail deserves examination. William is not merely a supportive cousin. He is the Prince of Wales, the heir. Every action he takes now is interpreted as rehearsal for kingship. His alliances signal future architecture. His priorities foreshadow institutional tone. So why step in? The answer lies partly in history. William has witnessed firsthand how fragile internal cohesion can become. He grew up inside a marriage that fractured publicly. He watched the press dissect private pain. As an adult, he experienced a different kind of rupture when his brother chose a path outside the royal framework. Whether one agrees with Harry's decisions or not, the result was undeniable: distance, distrust, and structural reconfiguration. William understands what happens when younger members feel unsupported or disconnected from the institution. Louise represents the opposite trajectory. She has not distanced herself. She has not criticized the monarchy. She has not monetized proximity. She has remained steady, aligned, and discreet. In many ways, she embodies the quieter branch of the family that continued working without complaint when public scrutiny intensified. By ensuring her inheritance moved forward without obstruction, William was not simply honoring Elizabeth's wish. He was reinforcing a principle. Loyalty will be supported. This principle matters because William's generation will define the monarchy in an era of heightened transparency and reduced deference. The institution no longer operates in a world where silence guarantees respect. It operates in a landscape where narrative moves at digital speed. To survive, the monarchy must cultivate figures who stabilize rather than inflame. Louise fits that mold. There is also the broader context of King Charles's health. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer following treatment for an enlarged prostate. While the specific type of cancer was not publicly disclosed, the message was clear. The king would continue treatment while managing a modified schedule. That announcement accelerated perception of transition. William stepped forward more visibly. State duties expanded. Diplomatic appearances increased. He began functioning not only as heir in waiting, but as de facto stabilizer. When a reigning monarch faces health uncertainty, internal dynamics sharpen. Trust becomes currency. In such an environment, William's protective stance towards certain family members reveals strategic intent. He appears to be shaping an inner circle defined less by birth order and more by reliability. Edward and Sophie, now Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, have assumed expanded roles with minimal controversy. Their steady presence aligns with William's emerging leadership style: low drama, high discipline, controlled messaging. Louise, as their daughter, sits within that trusted perimeter. Contrast this with figures who have been sidelined. Prince Andrew lost official duties following public controversy tied to his association with Jeffrey Epstein and a widely criticized interview. He no longer occupies a working role. Prince Harry resides in California, outside the formal structure of the monarchy, after stepping back from senior duties and publishing personal accounts that deepened internal strain. These developments did not merely reduce numbers, they reshaped internal equilibrium. William's involvement in safeguarding Louise's inheritance suggests he is reinforcing the branch that remained aligned during turbulence. This is not about favoritism, it is about continuity management. A future king must assess not only who stands closest in bloodline, but who strengthens institutional coherence. In modern monarchy, perception is as powerful as protocol. Aligning publicly with steady figures sends reassurance. There is another subtle layer. Balmoral is symbolic territory. It was Elizabeth's refuge. It carries emotional capital. By supporting Louise's place within that estate, William is signaling reverence for his grandmother's private wishes. In doing so, he binds himself to her legacy, not just ceremonially, but operationally. He is saying, through action rather than proclamation, the values she protected will be protected. And those values, discretion, restraint, loyalty, have not always been evenly distributed across the family. It is easy to interpret such moves as exclusionary, but monarchy, by nature, narrows as it modernizes. Public funding scrutiny, media exposure, and generational change require tighter operational cores. The era of sprawling, loosely defined royal roles is diminishing. William appears to understand this. His model seems leaner, more focused, more emotionally filtered. Louise's position within Balmoral, protected rather than marginalized, fits that architecture. It also communicates something about mentorship. William is only a few years older than Louise. Their generational overlap positions him not only as future sovereign, but as near-peer guide. By ensuring her place within the estate remains secure, he creates stability for a younger royal who may eventually take on greater visibility. He learned from fracture. Now he appears to be reinforcing cohesion. The monarchy is often described in constitutional terms: succession, regency, crown property. But beneath those mechanics lies a quieter framework. Trust networks. Who is invited? Who is defended? Who is prioritized? William's involvement in this inheritance is less about property lines and more about trust lines. He is drawing them carefully, and not everyone, it seems, is inside. If William's actions hint at the monarchy's future, then Queen Camilla's position reveals the complexity of its present. To understand why the inheritance to Lady Louise carries emotional undertones, one must examine not only who was chosen, but who was not at the center of that choice. Camilla, as queen consort, stands beside King Charles in every formal capacity. She attends state visits. She represents the crown at official engagements. She occupies a constitutionally recognized role. Yet monarchy has always operated on two parallel tracks: the formal structure and the emotional structure. Formally, Camilla is secure. Emotionally, her position has always been more layered. Her relationship with Charles began in the early 1970s. It preceded his marriage to Diana Spencer in 1981. That history became one of the most scrutinized narratives in modern royal life. The marriage between Charles and Diana fractured publicly, culminating in separation and divorce. Diana's interview in 1995, in which she famously remarked that there were 3 people in her marriage, reshaped public perception overnight. More than 20 million viewers in the United Kingdom watched that broadcast. The damage to Charles's reputation was immediate and profound. Camilla's presence in that story became inseparable from the turmoil. When Charles and Camilla eventually married in April 2005, the ceremony was civil, not religious. It took place at Windsor Guildhall. Notably, Queen Elizabeth did not attend the ceremony itself, though she hosted a reception afterward at Windsor Castle. Official explanations framed this as respect for constitutional roles and church considerations. Yet the optics lingered. The sovereign was present at the celebration but absent from the vows. In monarchy, optics matter. For years, public discourse speculated about Camilla's eventual title. Early communications suggested she would be known as Princess Consort when Charles became king, a designation designed to soften public resistance. The title Queen Consort carried historical weight and emotional baggage. It required acceptance not only from Parliament, but from the public and, perhaps most delicately, from within the family. In February 2022, during Platinum Jubilee celebrations marking 70 years of Elizabeth's reign, a carefully worded statement expressed the Queen's sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time came. The announcement was measured. It was dignified. But it was also strategic. The phrasing did not erupt with enthusiasm. It was deliberate, considered, almost legalistic in tone. This distinction between duty and affection is subtle but significant. Elizabeth was a monarch who separated personal sentiment from institutional necessity. She understood compromise. She understood political realism. Supporting Camilla's title stabilized Charles's reign. It reduced ambiguity. It prevented prolonged debate during succession. But a monarch's private will operates in a different space. A will is not negotiated with Parliament. It is not shaped by public relations. It reflects personal disposition. If Elizabeth chose to leave a cherished piece of Balmoral to Lady Louise, rather than redistribute private assets in a way that centered the Queen Consort, it invites interpretation not as rejection, but as prioritization. Because Balmoral was never about constitutional rank, it was about emotional trust. Camilla, by all official accounts, developed a respectful and steady relationship with Elizabeth in the later years. Their interactions were cordial. Public engagements appeared harmonious. Yet warmth in public does not always translate into intimacy in private. There is a difference between acceptance and belonging. Belonging, in Elizabeth's world, was earned through longevity of loyalty, quiet service, and alignment with the monarchy's tone. Camilla's path into the royal family was turbulent. It carried public skepticism that endured for decades. Even after rehabilitation of her image through consistent work, the memory of earlier years never fully vanished from cultural consciousness. Elizabeth, who endured enormous strain during the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, would have carried that history internally, not necessarily with resentment, but with awareness, and awareness shapes legacy decisions. The inheritance to Louise can be read as an affirmation of a different branch of the family, one untouched by past scandal, one defined by steady discretion. It signals where emotional continuity resides. It does not strip Camilla of her role. It does not diminish her authority as Queen Consort, but it places the emotional center of Balmoral elsewhere. There is another dimension to consider: generational alignment. Camilla's identity within the monarchy is closely intertwined with Charles. Her authority flows from partnership. When Charles ascended the throne, she rose with him. Her influence is significant within his reign. But when William eventually becomes king, Camilla's role transitions to Queen Dowager. That shift reduces formal power. It alters proximity to decision-making. If William's inner circle is already coalescing around figures such as Edward, Sophie, and potentially Louise, Camilla's long-term influence may depend more on personal relationships than institutional structure. And those relationships have always been complex. William's loyalty to his mother's memory is well documented. While he has maintained public civility with Camilla, the emotional terrain is nuanced. Time has softened tensions, but history does not evaporate. In that context, Elizabeth's private choice gains additional texture. By anchoring a portion of Balmoral to Louise, she reinforced a lineage that bypasses earlier controversy. It roots the estate's emotional future in stability rather than reconciliation. Monarchy survives on symbolism as much as statute. When Elizabeth communicated her wish regarding Camilla's title during the Jubilee, she did so publicly, intentionally, and strategically. When she arranged her private estate, She did so silently. Public endorsement can secure institutional calm. Private bequest reveals personal gravity. Camilla remains central to Charles's reign. She fulfills duties with consistency. Her charities and engagements contribute to the monarchy's public presence. Yet the inheritance narrative subtly delineates emotional territory. It suggests that while Camilla stands beside the throne, she may not stand at the heart of Balmoral's memory. That distinction is not explosive. It is quiet. But in royal language, quiet distinctions carry weight. Because monarchy is not only about crowns and titles. It is about who is trusted with the spaces where the crown is set down. And in Elizabeth's final gesture, that trust appears to have been placed elsewhere. If the inheritance of a cottage feels small on paper, the shift it represents is anything but small. Because what we are witnessing is not simply the distribution of private property. We are witnessing the quiet reorganization of emotional power inside one of the oldest institutions in the world. Every monarchy operates on two systems at once. The first is visible: titles, line of succession, constitutional law, public funding, ceremonial hierarchy. The second is invisible: trust, access, proximity, emotional legitimacy. Queen Elizabeth mastered the balance between those systems for more than 70 years. She understood that the crown survives not only through law, but through tone, through the careful calibration of who feels included and who is gently distanced. Now that calibration is evolving. King Charles reigns, but his reign began under extraordinary scrutiny and personal vulnerability. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that he had been diagnosed with cancer. While he continues to carry out duties, his schedule is managed carefully. Public appearances fluctuate. Treatment remains ongoing. That reality has accelerated transition dynamics. Prince William is no longer merely preparing for kingship in theory. He is operating in practice. Each engagement he undertakes, each decision he influences, builds the framework of the monarchy he will eventually lead. And the framework he appears to be building is leaner. In previous generations, the royal family functioned with a broader working body. Numerous cousins and extended relatives undertook patronages. Public roles were more diffuse, but modern scrutiny, financial transparency, and shifting public sentiment have forced consolidation. The monarchy cannot afford fragmentation. In recent years, fragmentation has already occurred. Prince Andrew stepped back from public duties after controversy surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein and a widely criticized interview. His withdrawal reshaped the working structure. Prince Harry and Meghan chose to step back from senior royal roles and relocate abroad, further reducing the operational core. The result is a smaller institution. In such an environment, loyalty becomes strategic capital. Edward and Sophie have increasingly filled operational gaps with little fanfare. They represent continuity without controversy. Their presence reassures rather than destabilizes. Their daughter, Lady Louise, belongs to that stable branch. By supporting her place within Balmoral, William is reinforcing a pattern. The future monarchy will prioritize steadiness over spectacle. There is symbolism in geography. Balmoral has long functioned as a reset point for the royal family. It is where tensions cooled, where difficult conversations unfolded away from cameras, where children ran across open fields without press intrusion. It is also where Queen Elizabeth passed away. That location sealed Balmoral as sacred ground in the modern royal narrative. Its emotional gravity intensified. Whoever occupies space within it occupies symbolic continuity. When Elizabeth anchored a portion of that estate to Louise, she was not merely gifting walls and land. She was embedding a younger generation inside memory. And when William ensured that embedding remained undisturbed, he aligned himself with that memory. This alignment matters because monarchy is ultimately about story. The story William appears to be shaping emphasizes discipline, emotional containment, controlled modernization, fewer voices, but stronger cohesion. Contrast this with earlier eras when public disagreements spilled outward, interviews fractured mystique, memoirs detailed grievances, legal disputes exposed vulnerability. The lesson from those years seems clear. Expansion without alignment invites instability. William's emerging circle reflects contraction toward trust. Camilla's future position underscores this transition further. As queen consort, her authority is tied to Charles's reign. When William becomes king, she will hold the title of Queen Dowager. Respect will remain, but operational influence will likely narrow. The center of gravity will shift generationally. That generational shift is already visible. William and Catherine present a model grounded in measured visibility and family stability. Edward and Sophie mirror that steadiness. Louise, studying at St. Andrews, the same university where William met Catherine, embodies continuity across educational and social lines. This does not mean exclusion is dramatic. It is often subtle. Monarchies rarely announce emotional reconfiguration. They demonstrate it through seating arrangements, property allocations, joint appearances, and absence. Absence can be louder than speech. The inheritance narrative does not accuse. It does not confront. It simply reveals alignment. And alignment is everything when public trust fluctuates. Financial considerations also hover in the background. Balmoral, like all large estates, carries maintenance costs. King Charles has signaled interest in cost efficiency across royal operations. Yet the cottage associated with Louise appears secure. That security suggests prioritization amid pruning. Pruning is not destruction. It is refinement. The British monarchy is refining itself in real time. It is narrowing to figures who generate stability rather than uncertainty. It is centering branches that have not challenged institutional coherence. It is preparing for a reign under William that will likely be more controlled, more focused, and less forgiving of deviation. Lady Louise may or may not choose a prominent working role in the future. At 21, her path remains flexible. She could maintain a private life adjacent to the crown. She could gradually assume duties if needed. That ambiguity is part of her value. She is not overexposed. Flexibility within loyalty is rare. Queen Elizabeth's final private decision suggests she recognized that rarity. The will remains sealed for decades. Legal pages will not be opened for public scrutiny anytime soon. But monarchy has always communicated through gesture more than disclosure. An invitation to Balmoral, a brooch gifted quietly, a cottage placed in careful hands. These gestures accumulate into narrative. And the narrative emerging now is clear. The future of the crown will be shaped not by those who command headlines, but by those who preserve equilibrium. Queen Elizabeth spent a lifetime safeguarding that equilibrium. In her final private act, she appeared to identify who could help sustain it. Not the loudest voice, not the most powerful title, but the steadiest presence. And as the monarchy moves through uncertainty into its next chapter, steadiness may prove to be its most valuable inheritance of all. The bell rang 9 times. Not the grand peal that greets state banquets, not the ceremonial chime that marks a wedding. This was slower, measured, deliberate, each strike swallowed by the winter air before the next one fell. Inside the Chapel of the Oak, doors were sealed. No press rota, no palace photographer, no live stream. The House of Windsor was not performing for the world that night. It was closing something, and opening something else. By dawn, Thornfield would no longer be described as a rural holding quietly attached to the crown's portfolio. It would become a line drawn in ink. The convoy left Windsor under a sky the color of dark velvet. 3 unmarked vehicles. No flags, no outriders. They moved through Berkshire lanes and back roads, known more to gamekeepers than journalists. The northern gate opened without announcement. By the time the engines went silent, the estate was already in shadow. There are properties that symbolize leisure. There are properties that symbolize retreat. Thornfield has never been either. Those who understand the private architecture of the monarchy know it as something far more consequential, a reserve of continuity, a place where duty is rehearsed long before it is revealed. That evening, it ceased being rehearsal. The official announcement would not come until morning. A statement, embossed and restrained, issued through the proper office, endorsed at the highest level. It would confirm what insiders had whispered for weeks. Prince James, Earl of Wessex, had been granted full title and custodianship of the historic estate. Sole heir, executive authority, effective immediately. But the document, precise and polished, would conceal more than it disclosed. Because what happened before the statement was uploaded is the part that matters. Within the chapel walls, beneath beams darkened by centuries of prayer and oath, a wooden vault was brought forward. 4 drawers. 3 of them opened at defining moments in modern royal history. The 4th had remained sealed. Until now. Present were only those whose loyalty has never required headlines. The key turned once, then again. The drawer released with the faintest breath of old timber. Inside lay a single velvet envelope. The letter had been written in the winter of 2016. Addressed in a hand that required no signature. It bore no public seal. It was never meant for archives. It was meant for one reader. Prince James stood while he read it. Those close enough to witness the moment would later describe no theatrics, no collapse into sentiment, only stillness. His jaw tightened once, his shoulders straightened. When he reached the final line, he folded the paper carefully, pressed it to his lips, and said one word. Understood. The envelope was returned. The drawer was closed, the vault resealed. Outside, the bell sounded its final note. By the time the first light moved across Thornfield's upper fields, the transfer was complete in spirit long before it was confirmed in law. At precisely 9 in the morning, the palace released its statement. It was brief, surgical. It named Prince James as the estate's inheritor and steward. It referenced sovereign decree and rural succession provisions. It carried the full institutional weight of endorsement. There was no press conference, no balcony appearance, no smiling handshake on the gravel drive. Just parchment, ink, finality. To the casual observer, it looked like a routine inheritance, a generational shift, a young royal entrusted with land and legacy. But timing is never accidental. The announcement arrived days after a week of competing headlines, public spectacle, commercial entanglements, commentary that threatened to blur the line between monarchy and marketplace. While others argued over narrative, the crown moved in silence. Thornfield is not merely acreage, it is infrastructure, it is continuity. It is a living rehearsal for governance, stripped of microphones. Whoever holds it holds more than a title, and now it belongs to James. Those within Clarence House understood the signal immediately. This was not indulgence, it was calibration, a deliberate tightening of the circle around those who will shape the next era of the monarchy. Youth, yes, but disciplined youth, quiet youth, uncontaminated by performance. When James emerged from the chapel grounds shortly before sunrise, he did so alone, no aides, no ceremonial escort. He walked the perimeter for over an hour, boots cutting faint impressions into frost-hardened earth. He paused once at the orchard planted generations ago. He did not speak. He did not need to, because this was never about applause. It was about alignment. By mid-morning, correspondents began to dissect the wording of the decree. Analysts debated valuation, commentators speculated on symbolism, social feeds filled with approval, surprise, curiosity. But the true message had already been delivered the night before, under timber beams and candlelight. A gate had closed, and a new guardian now stood behind it. At first glance, the morning decree looked almost dull by design. A short statement, proper headings, no flourish, no quotes from beaming relatives, no carefully staged countryside photo op to soften the message. The palace released it the way institutions release decisions they do not intend to debate, clean, final, and quietly irreversible. But in royal language, restraint is never emptiness. Restraint is code. The declaration confirmed that Prince James, Earl of Wessex, had been designated the sole heir and steward of Thornfield. Not a partial grant, not a ceremonial affiliation, not a shared custodianship that could be interpreted later. The wording carried the most decisive phrase the monarchy uses when it wants to prevent future arguments: full title and custodianship, effective immediately. That single construction did more than transfer land. It transferred authority. It meant James could oversee the estate's trustees, approve operational budgets, sign off on conservation priorities, and control the public-facing narrative of the property's heritage assets. It meant Thornfield would not drift in dormant management, attached loosely to the crown's portfolio, and vulnerable to the kind of symbolic claims that grow in the shadows of ambiguity. It meant a gate had been shut legally, administratively, and politically. Then came the endorsements. Palace observers noticed the choice instantly. The statement did not merely bear the king's approval, it was personally endorsed by Princess Anne. In most royal communications, the Princess Royal's name appears as a functional presence, patronage, schedule, duty. Here, it carried a different weight. Anne's endorsement signals more than family support. It signals institutional discipline. The difference matters because Anne is not the monarchy's soft voice. She is the voice that turns tradition into procedure, and procedure into enforcement. When Anne signs on, the palace is not hinting, it is locking in. And so the question shifted. Not, why does James get an estate, but why does the palace want Thornfield settled now? Timing answered it. The decree arrived in a week, when the royal ecosystem had been pulled in two directions: spectacle outside the institution and consolidation within it. Headlines elsewhere were noisy. Public conversation, especially online, was saturated with dispute, accusation, and monetized identity. In that environment, the palace chose the opposite weapon, a bureaucratic move with historic consequences delivered without fanfare. That contrast was the point. Within royal households, big decisions are rarely staged as big decisions. They are staged as paperwork. The more consequential the shift, the more it is dressed as routine. It disarms critics, frustrates opportunists, and tells insiders exactly what they need to know. The machinery has moved. According to those familiar with the internal process, The statement was finalized shortly before the weekly Privy Council meeting, with legal representatives and the royal household's property administrators present for a closed briefing. That detail matters because it places Thornfield in the realm of governance, not gossip. It implies procedure. It implies that whatever was being debated behind those doors had already crossed the threshold from family preference to institutional necessity. And not everyone wanted it done. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, there were reportedly objections from senior courtiers who argued the estate should remain under quiet custodianship. Their reasoning was predictable. The younger generation should not be handed complex assets too early. Constitutional optics can be fussy. Modern media can misread succession moves as internal rivalry. The monarchy, after all, has learned the hard way that people will interpret any transfer of status as a chess move, whether the palace intended it or not. But those objections were overridden. That is where the decree becomes more than a property transfer, because overriding resistance requires not only confidence in James, but a belief that the risk of leaving Thornfield unresolved was greater than the risk of acting. In other words, something needed to be prevented. The phrase sole heir does not merely crown James with responsibility. It strips everyone else present or future of plausible pathways to claim symbolic association. There is no co-stewardship, no shared legacy role that could be sold as a reconciliation gesture, no heritage access narrative that could be floated through friendly media. Sole means soul. That is why the palace published the statement without staging a performance around it. Performance invites negotiation. Paper does not. By mid-morning, correspondents were already doing what correspondents do: calculating valuation, mapping boundaries, scanning precedent, but the palace had aimed the message elsewhere toward the people who understand what a locked deed actually accomplishes. When the king puts his signature on a transfer like this, he is not only supporting James, he is asserting that Thornfield belongs inside the institution's future plan, not on the edges of its past. And when Anne endorses it, she is adding the monarchy's most unromantic guarantee: it will be enforced, maintained, and protected from narrative drift. The most revealing detail, however, was not in what the statement said. It was in what it refused to offer. No reassurance, no explanation, no "this is purely symbolic," no invitation for public debate over whether the estate should be opened, rebranded, shared, or leveraged. Just a confirmation, which, in palace terms, is as close to a warning as you will ever get. To understand why the decree matters, you have to understand what Thornfield actually is. On paper, it is described as a rural estate set within protected countryside, bordered by riverland to the east and chalk ridges to the west. It includes a Palladian manor constructed in the Georgian period, a private chapel rarely listed on public registries, tenant villages operating under long-standing agricultural charters, and several thousand acres of mixed woodland, pasture, and experimental farmland. But paper rarely captures purpose. Thornfield does not sit inside the royal portfolio as a decorative relic. It sits as infrastructure. Unlike Sandringham, which the public associates with family Christmases and sporting tradition, or Balmoral, which evokes Highland sovereignty and private mourning, Thornfield has always been quieter. It was built not as a spectacle residence, but as a retreat for study and strategy. Early archives describe it as a place for botanical experimentation, agricultural reform trials, and discreet wartime coordination. During the 20th century, it hosted research initiatives that blurred the line between land management and statecraft. That institutional DNA still runs through it. Within the estate boundaries stand not only heritage structures but functional systems. Renewable land initiatives piloted in coordination with the duchy's sustainability programs, conservation laboratories originally commissioned to test forestry resilience, and equestrian facilities updated under modern biosecurity standards. Thornfield's library, considered one of the last intact private royal collections outside Windsor, contains land treaties, estate audits, and annotated constitutional commentaries spanning centuries. This is not leisure property. It is a working blueprint for how the monarchy intends to appear competent in a world that now evaluates it like a corporation. In recent years, the Crown's survival strategy has relied on demonstrating relevance without overt political entanglement. Environmental stewardship has become one of the few arenas where symbolism and substance can coexist safely. Thornfield, designated in internal planning documents as a cornerstone of the royal green transition, sits at the center of that balancing act. Whoever controls Thornfield controls that narrative. Under modernization frameworks drafted during the later years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, certain estates were categorized not merely as holdings, but as demonstration anchors. Thornfield was one of them. Its agricultural model, combining regenerative farming with heritage conservation, was intended to serve as a proof of concept for how tradition could align with contemporary responsibility. That makes the identity of its steward consequential. If Thornfield were left in dormant custodianship, it could be interpreted as symbolic territory open to association, commentary, or even claims of shared legacy. A property untethered from a named guardian becomes a narrative vacuum, and vacuums in the modern media age do not remain empty for long. By naming James as sole heir and executive steward, the palace removed ambiguity. It ensured that Thornfield would be shaped by someone raised entirely within the institution's current discipline structure. Someone whose public image is not entangled in brand experiments or cross-border ventures. Someone whose authority derives from quiet apprenticeship rather than televised grievance. The estate's strategic importance extends even deeper. Historically, Thornfield has been used for continuity planning. Though details remain classified, archival footnotes from late 20th century audits suggest the estate was evaluated for its capacity to operate autonomously under certain contingencies. Reinforced infrastructure, discrete access routes, and layered internal systems were justified not for theatrical intrigue, but for resilience. That legacy lingers in the estate's design philosophy: preparedness without publicity. In a post-referendum, post-scandal environment where media scrutiny is relentless and reputational risk travels globally in seconds, having assets that are insulated yet functional is not romantic. It is prudent, which is why the decree reads less like a gift and more like a security measure. The appointment of a young steward is not a gamble on youth. It is a reinforcement of continuity. Thornfield does not require a charismatic ambassador. It requires a disciplined custodian capable of absorbing institutional knowledge and applying it without distortion. Prince William's regenerative farming initiatives within the duchy align neatly with Thornfield's long-term planning. The Crown's sustainability messaging gains coherence when estates speak the same language. Thornfield, under James, becomes part of a coordinated architecture rather than a nostalgic footnote. And that coordination matters because the monarchy no longer survives on mystique alone, it survives on operational credibility. There is also the symbolic dimension. Land, in the British constitutional imagination, has always been tied to legitimacy. Titles can be debated, public approval can fluctuate, but land, stewarded responsibly across generations, communicates permanence. By entrusting Thornfield to James, the palace is signaling that the next era of the monarchy will root itself deeper into territory, not float on personality. The manor, the chapel, the woodland laboratories, these are not props. They are classrooms. They are proving grounds. They are spaces where heirs learn the weight of inheritance in silence. And silence, in this context, is strength. While headlines swirl elsewhere about contracts, platforms, and public disputes, Thornfield stands as a counterweight, a place where value is measured not in engagement metrics but in soil health, tenant stability, and archival preservation. That contrast is deliberate. The monarchy is repositioning itself as a system rather than a spectacle. In that system, Thornfield is not simply land, it is leverage, and now it has a name attached to it. If Thornfield is leverage, then Prince James is the mechanism designed to operate it. For years, he occupied the margins of royal coverage, photographed at church services, noted politely in official programs, rarely quoted, almost never analyzed. In an era when even minor gestures are amplified into headlines, his relative invisibility was not accidental. It was formative. Those close to Princess Anne have long described her mentorship style in a single word: uncompromising. Anne does not groom heirs with sentiment. She trains them through exposure to process, estate meetings, budget reviews, tenant disputes, conservation audits, the quiet, repetitive disciplines that turn heritage into management. It is widely understood within palace circles that Thornfield's operational oversight has rested informally under Anne's supervision for decades. If James has been prepared for anything, he has been prepared for that. Sources familiar with his schedule after his 17th birthday confirm that he began spending extended periods at the estate, not as a guest, but as a participant. He attended land management briefings, sat in on sustainability consultations, observed negotiations between trustees and agricultural partners. No press coverage, no social media documentation, just exposure. This matters because the monarchy has learned that charisma without infrastructure is volatile. James's defining trait, according to one retired official, is not brilliance, it is steadiness. He does not rush to speak, the source remarked. He listens until the shape of the room is clear. That temperament aligns precisely with what Thornfield requires. The estate does not need reinvention. It needs continuity sharpened for a new era. Its renewable land programs must expand without alienating traditional tenets. Its conservation initiatives must project modern relevance without appearing political. Its heritage must be preserved without becoming commodified nostalgia. Balancing those tensions demands discipline, not theatricality. It is also impossible to ignore the generational triangulation quietly forming around James. Within the Wales household, Prince George carries the direct line of succession, a role already under public microscope. Princess Charlotte, widely regarded as naturally adept at communication and diplomacy, has developed a reputation for absorbing policy briefings well beyond ceremonial expectation. James occupies a different axis. He is not heir to the throne. He is heir to systems. During a private Norfolk retreat earlier in the year, insiders say James joined estate orientation briefings at the Sandringham Annex. The sessions reportedly covered digital estate management platforms, renewable grant frameworks, and emergency continuity protocols. It was not glamorous. It was granular. Charlotte's reported comment afterward, "He doesn't ask twice, he just gets it," circulated quietly among aides. Whether apocryphal or not, it captured the perception taking root inside the institution. James is not competing for spotlight. He is absorbing responsibility. That distinction is critical. The vow he is said to have spoken in the chapel, "I serve, not replace," resonates, because it addresses an anxiety embedded in modern royal discourse. Every transfer of role invites speculation about rivalry. Every emerging figure is framed as a challenger to someone else's narrative space. By articulating service rather than succession, James positioned himself as reinforcement, not threat. It is a subtle but strategic posture. King Charles' decision to override objections and formalize the transfer reflects more than paternal confidence. It reflects an assessment that James is institutionally aligned. Alignment, in royal terms, means internal discipline, respect for hierarchy, and insulation from commercial entanglement. In the wake of recent controversies surrounding brand experimentation and blurred boundaries between monarchy and marketplace, alignment has become the palace's most guarded currency. James represents a clean slate in that regard. He has not launched initiatives that require external sponsorship. He has not cultivated media narratives that hinge on personal grievance. His public identity remains defined almost entirely by duty and study. That simplicity is an asset. Princess Anne's presence at the ceremony further underscores that this is not a sentimental passing of land between relatives. It is a baton transfer within an institutional relay. Anne has built her reputation on endurance. Her endorsement signals that James has met an internal threshold. Prince Edward's reported words during the offering, "This land does not belong to us. We belong to it," reinforce the philosophy underpinning the transfer. Stewardship, not ownership. Responsibility, not entitlement. That philosophy stands in deliberate contrast to contemporary models of influence built on personal brand. Thornfield under James is not designed to become a backdrop for curated image. It is designed to become a workshop for institutional resilience. The palace understands that younger royals will be judged not only on ceremonial grace but on measurable competence. Environmental targets, tenant relations, archival preservation, financial transparency, these are the metrics by which estates will now be evaluated. James's preparation appears tailored to that reality. There is also a psychological dimension. For a generation raised in the shadow of public family fractures, stability is not inherited automatically. It must be demonstrated. By entrusting Thornfield to James at this stage, the monarchy is signaling faith in his capacity to internalize lessons learned from past turbulence. He is not being elevated as a celebrity figure. He is being installed as a custodian. That word matters. Custodianship implies guardianship over something larger than oneself. It implies accountability to history and to future heirs not yet visible. It is a role that absorbs ego rather than amplifies it. In that sense, James's rise is less about ascent and more about anchoring. As analysts debate symbolism and commentators speculate on palace politics, the more revealing story is unfolding quietly within estate ledgers and planning committees. Meetings are being scheduled, transition documents finalized, long-term sustainability targets reassigned under new stewardship. This is not a coronation, it is an onboarding. But within the architecture of the monarchy, onboarding can be just as consequential as crowning. Because while the public may focus on titles, the institution focuses on systems, and systems endure only when someone is willing to operate them without demanding applause. James appears willing, and that willingness may prove to be the most strategic asset of all. The sealed drawer was never meant to become part of public conversation. Within the palace, Certain artifacts exist, not as heritage displays, but as instruments of continuity. The Elizabeth box is one of them. A wooden cabinet with 4 internal chambers, catalogued but rarely described. It has surfaced only at moments when the institution required more than ceremony. It required recalibration. On the night Thornfield passed to James, the 4th chamber was opened. There were no transcripts, no press briefings afterward. Even among senior staff, knowledge of its contents was limited to those physically present. But what is known, what has filtered through disciplined whispers, is enough to understand why the ritual matters. The letter inside was written in the winter of 2016, during a period when the monarchy was already recalculating its trajectory. It was addressed specifically to James, though at the time he was still far from public prominence. That alone is significant. It suggests foresight, a recognition that continuity does not always run in straight lines of succession, but in lines of stability. James read the letter standing. He did not rush. Those observing later remarked that he read certain passages twice. When he finished, he folded it carefully, not with the casual crease of a document, but with the deliberation of something being returned to silence. His single word "understood" was not theatrical, it was declarative. And then the drawer was closed. The ritual that followed was structured in 3 movements, though never publicly codified. The first, often referred to internally as the sealing, involves acknowledging the land as precedent rather than possession. The altar Bible is placed not as religious ornament, but as constitutional symbol. It represents the covenant between crown and country, a reminder that estates are not trophies but trusts. The second movement, the offering, binds heir to soil. Princess Anne presented the Clementine dagger, forged in the early 20th century and historically associated with inspection of wartime command tunnels. Its presence has often been misunderstood. The blade is not drawn. It is not a relic of aggression. It symbolizes vigilance, the duty to guard without provocation, to defend without spectacle. Anne's reported whisper, "Guard the realm without ever raising it," encapsulates that ethos. The modern monarchy survives not through confrontation but through restraint. Prince Edward's contribution carried a different weight. A wooden vessel filled with soil from the estate orchard, where King Charles once planted a tree as a child. This land does not belong to us. We belong to it. The phrasing is deceptively simple. It reframes inheritance as obligation. It denies entitlement and replaces it with stewardship. When James knelt and placed both objects upon the altar, the symbolism was complete. The line had passed not merely in legal documentation but in philosophical orientation. Then came the vow. I serve, not replace. 4 words that address a tension the monarchy has grappled with since the abdication crisis of 1936. Succession, in public imagination, often implies displacement. For an institution sensitive to narratives of rivalry, that perception is dangerous. By articulating service over substitution, James aligned himself with continuity rather than competition. It was not a challenge to George, not an overshadowing of Charlotte. It was an affirmation that his role exists within a lattice of responsibilities, not above it. The unexpected presence of Charlotte that evening adds another layer. She was not formally scheduled in the ritual order, yet she arrived wearing her green sash, a private heirloom from the final years of her grandmother's reign. She presented James with a wax-sealed envelope containing a hand-drawn map of royal estates, annotated with risk assessments and restoration timelines. Whether romanticized or precise, the gesture symbolized generational coordination, not rivalry, not hierarchy, coordination. "You'll need this before the cameras find you," she reportedly said. It was a reminder that stewardship now includes narrative defense. Estates are not merely physical assets, they are symbolic arenas. Whoever stands at their gates must understand how quickly perception can distort purpose. By dawn, the ritual was complete. The palace's decision to release only a single monochrome image the next morning, no caption, no statement beyond the formal decree, was intentional. The institution has learned that mystery, when controlled, reinforces authority. Overexposure dilutes it. Public reaction unfolded predictably. Supporters framed the transfer as restoration. Commentators described it as consolidation. Online discourse split along familiar lines, some praising the return to order, others searching for hidden motives. But inside the palace, the ritual achieved something more specific. It eliminated ambiguity. There will be no co-stewardship model, no ceremonial association extended as olive branch, no shared narrative space carved out within Thornfield's boundaries. The estate now has a singular guardian. That singularity is protective. The timing underscores this interpretation. In recent years, attempts have been made subtle and overt to frame certain royal properties as shared heritage platforms. Proposals floated about symbolic access, cross-branch collaboration, or joint appearances intended to project unity. Such gestures are often interpreted by the public as reconciliation. But reconciliation without structural clarity invites future disputes. By formalizing James's stewardship through ritual as well as decree, the palace has made Thornfield non-negotiable. There is also an internal message embedded in the ceremony. Younger members of the family observing from varying distances will understand that elevation within the institution follows preparation, not publicity. It follows discipline, not demand. The monarchy is signaling that roles are earned through alignment with institutional priorities. That is a cultural correction. The Clementine dagger and the vessel of soil were not mere props. They were reminders of a hierarchy of values: vigilance, humility, responsibility. In an age where influence is often measured in audience metrics, the ritual reasserted an older metric: endurance. James's walk across the estate perimeter the following morning, alone and unaccompanied, may appear symbolic to outsiders. Within palace culture, it is practical. Walking boundaries is an act of familiarization. It embeds geography into memory. It transforms maps into lived terrain. He was not surveying property. He was internalizing obligation. The absence of theatrical flourish throughout the process is perhaps the most revealing detail. No balcony wave, no celebratory banquet, no interviews. The silence was not emptiness, it was insulation. Because Thornfield's significance is not intended for daily consumption, it is intended for decades of continuity. The monarchy has chosen to strengthen its quiet infrastructure rather than its visible glamour. The sealed drawer, the vow, the objects placed upon the altar, these are not gestures designed to trend. They are gestures designed to endure. And endurance, in the architecture of royal survival, is the only metric that ultimately matters. By the time public conversation caught up with the symbolism of Thornfield, the palace had already moved to its next layer of strategy. What appears, on the surface, to be a singular estate transfer is in fact part of a broader recalibration. Sources close to the Privy Council confirm that the decree concerning Thornfield did not emerge in isolation. It sits within a larger framework informally referred to among senior aides as legacy zoning. The concept is straightforward, even if its implications are not. Certain estates are being designated as generational anchors, properties assigned clear lines of stewardship, protected from interpretive drift, and aligned with long-term institutional priorities. These anchors are not random. They correspond to thematic pillars the monarchy intends to reinforce: environmental credibility, constitutional literacy, cultural preservation, and operational resilience. Thornfield is the prototype. By entrusting it to James, the crown has established a template. A younger royal, raised entirely within the discipline of the current system, trained in process rather than performance, installed with both legal authority and symbolic affirmation. No ambiguity, no shared access, no blurred jurisdiction. That template will not remain confined to one estate. Within internal briefings, references have surfaced to parallel adjustments involving outlying holdings connected to Balmoral, annexed tracts near Sandringham, and select properties within Cornwall's wider orbit. Each is reportedly under review to determine how best to align them with the monarchy's future architecture. The objective is insulation. For the past decade, the institution has been tested by reputational volatility amplified through global media. Personal grievances have been monetized. Internal tensions have been televised. Brand building has overlapped uncomfortably with royal identity. The result has been a steady erosion of narrative clarity. Legacy zoning is the countermeasure. Instead of reacting to headlines, the palace is pre-allocating authority. It is deciding, quietly and in advance, which members of the family will anchor which domains of responsibility. That reduces the risk of symbolic encroachment. It limits the space in which alternative narratives can claim shared heritage without formal endorsement. Prince James's installation at Thornfield exemplifies this shift. There is a deliberate contrast embedded in the move. While certain figures remain entangled in legal disputes, media negotiations, and brand recalibrations, Thornfield represents a different trajectory. It is not tied to streaming platforms. It is not leveraged for lifestyle endorsements. It does not host curated visibility. Its value lies in continuity. This contrast has not gone unnoticed. Public reaction has largely favored the palace's restraint. The phrase, "return to order," has surfaced repeatedly in commentary. Yet beneath that surface approval lies something more structural, a recalibration of what royal relevance means. In the contemporary landscape, influence often depends on immediacy. The monarchy is pivoting toward longevity. King Charles's role in this transition cannot be overstated. Overriding internal hesitation to formalize the Thornfield transfer required confidence that James embodies the kind of alignment necessary for the next era. It also required a willingness to accept that some branches of the extended family will no longer occupy equal narrative space. That recalibration is subtle but unmistakable. The creation of the Thornfield Heritage Steward position for Lady Louise reinforces the pattern. Louise, academically inclined and consistently discreet, embodies the qualities currently prized within the institution: discipline, loyalty, and minimal media entanglement. Her involvement signals that the estate will not be stewarded in isolation. It will be part of a coordinated generational block. Some aides have privately referred to this block as the clean branch, not in moralistic terms, but in operational ones. Clean of controversy, clean of commercial ambiguity, clean of unresolved public disputes. That clarity is strategic. The monarchy cannot prevent external criticism. It cannot silence commentary, but it can tighten its internal structure. By designating clear custodians and restricting symbolic access, it reduces the potential for estates to become stages for contested narratives. There is also an educational dimension emerging. Princess Catherine has reportedly engaged in discussions regarding a structured curriculum for younger royals, an academic pathway rooted in constitutional history, public ethics, and institutional accountability. While details remain sparse, the concept suggests an acknowledgement that modern heirs must be equipped not only with ceremonial poise but with analytical competence. In that context, James's preparation at Thornfield appears less like favoritism and more like pilot programming. He is not merely inheriting land. He is inheriting a test case for how the monarchy intends to function under intensified scrutiny. Sustainability metrics will be tracked. Tenant relations will be monitored. Public reporting may increase. The estate could become a model for how tradition adapts without surrendering identity, and that identity is being redrawn. Where previous decades allowed for broader interpretive flexibility regarding royal roles, the current strategy favors delineation. Clear titles, clear duties, clear boundaries. Thornfield's deed does not invite collaboration beyond its appointed steward. It codifies responsibility. This is not punishment directed outward. It is precision directed inward. By narrowing access to core assets, the palace reduces the likelihood of future conflict over symbolic territory. It prevents the recurrence of scenarios in which shared heritage is invoked to justify independent ventures. It clarifies that certain spaces, geographical and narrative, are now institutionally secured. Prince Harry's absence from the ceremony was not commented upon publicly, but insiders confirm the guest list was vetted with unusual care. Invitations were extended only to those without unresolved legal entanglements or active public disputes involving the crown. The message was understated yet unmistakable. Alignment precedes access. That principle now governs more than one estate. The monarchy has entered a phase of architectural thinking. Instead of addressing controversies individually, it is redesigning the framework within which they arise. By preemptively allocating roles and codifying stewardship, it narrows the field of interpretive freedom. James stands at the forefront of that shift. He is not a reformer. He is not a rebel. He is not a media phenomenon. He is a steward trained in the mechanics of inheritance. In an era saturated with spectacle, that ordinariness is radical. The long-term impact of Thornfield's transfer will not be measured in trending topics. It will be measured in stability, in whether, years from now, the estate remains a coherent expression of institutional values rather than a contested symbol. The palace has chosen to write this chapter in ink rather than pencil. It has signaled that future roles will be structured, not improvised. And in doing so, it has quietly reshaped the monarchy's internal map. Thornfield is no longer a quiet jewel tucked within rural holdings. It is a locked gate, and the key now rests firmly in James's hand. The bells of tradition have always carried a certain weight inside the British monarchy. They echo through stone corridors, across palace courtyards, and through centuries of history. For generations, those echoes have symbolized continuity, stability, and the quiet promise that the crown would endure no matter what storms surrounded it. But sometimes, even institutions built on centuries of tradition find themselves standing at the edge of an unexpected turning point. In recent weeks, something unusual has been unfolding behind the guarded gates of Buckingham Palace. At first glance, it may appear to be just another royal scandal, another headline competing for attention in a world already saturated with political drama and celebrity spectacle. Yet the situation now gripping the royal household is not simply about controversy or embarrassment. It is about power, responsibility, and the fragile balance that keeps one of the world's oldest institutions standing. The arrest of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has sent shockwaves far beyond the palace walls. For many observers, It represents the most serious crisis to confront the royal family in years. The allegations surrounding Andrew have reopened painful questions about judgment, accountability, and the standards expected of those born into privilege and influence. Every development in the case has intensified public scrutiny, placing enormous pressure on the monarchy to demonstrate that it can respond decisively when its reputation is at stake. But while much of the world has focused on the scandal itself, a quieter story has been unfolding inside the palace. Behind closed doors, senior members of the royal family have been forced to confront a difficult reality. The monarchy is not only facing a public relations disaster, it is facing a moment that could redefine how power is exercised within the institution. At the center of that shift stands Prince William. For years, William has prepared for the day when the responsibilities of the crown would eventually pass to him. As the heir to the throne, he has spent decades observing how the monarchy functions, how it navigates crises, and how fragile public trust can be. Those close to the palace say that he has long believed the institution must evolve if it hopes to remain relevant in the modern era. Stability alone is no longer enough. Transparency, accountability, and decisive leadership have become essential. Now, as the Andrew scandal intensifies, William finds himself stepping into a role that goes beyond the traditional expectations of an heir. While King Charles remains the monarch, sources close to the royal household suggest that William has begun playing a far more central role in guiding the family's response to the crisis. Decisions about how to distance the monarchy from controversy, how to reassure the public, and how to protect the crown's credibility are increasingly shaped by the prince who will one day inherit it. This emerging dynamic has created new tensions inside the royal circle. Some see William's growing influence as a necessary step towards safeguarding the monarchy's future. Others worry that the balance between generations is shifting faster than anyone expected. Because beneath the formal ceremonies and carefully choreographed appearances lies a deeper question, one that few inside the palace can ignore. Who truly holds the power shaping the future of the British monarchy today? As the scandal surrounding Andrew continues to unfold, the answer to that question may determine not only the fate of one disgraced royal, but the direction of the crown itself. The moment that changed everything did not begin with a ceremony or a speech. It began with a headline. News of Andrew Mountbatten, Windsor's arrest spread across international media with stunning speed. Within hours, television networks, newspapers, and digital platforms were all repeating the same question. How could a member of the British royal family once again become the center of such a devastating controversy? Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was immediate and tense. Senior advisors gathered behind closed doors, their conversations urgent and careful. For the monarchy, this was not merely a legal matter concerning one individual. It was a crisis that threatened to reopen wounds the institution had spent years trying to close. The shadow of Andrew's past associations had never fully disappeared, and now the situation had escalated into something far more serious. Public confidence, always delicate when it comes to royal reputation, was suddenly under enormous pressure. Across the United Kingdom and beyond, commentators began asking whether the monarchy had learned anything from previous scandals. Critics questioned whether the royal family had acted too slowly in the past when confronting controversies involving its own members. Supporters, meanwhile, argued that the institution had already taken steps to distance itself from Andrew, stripping him of public duties and removing him from many official roles. But the arrest transformed the narrative. What had once been a controversy about poor judgment now looked, to many observers, like a crisis of accountability. The pressure on Buckingham Palace to respond decisively was immense. Yet the most striking development was not the public statements released to the press. It was the internal shift taking place behind the palace's historic walls. While King Charles remained the reigning monarch, many insiders began to notice that Prince William was taking a more active role in shaping the royal family's strategy. Meetings with advisors increasingly included the Prince of Wales. Discussions about how to address the growing public outrage were no longer limited to the king and his closest aides. William's voice had become central to the conversation. Those familiar with the inner workings of the royal household say this change did not happen suddenly. Over the past several years, William has gradually taken on greater responsibility in matters related to the monarchy's public image and long-term stability. He has become deeply involved in decisions about charitable initiatives, media strategy, and the overall direction of royal engagements. But the Andrew crisis accelerated that process dramatically. The reason is simple. Moments of crisis reveal where leadership truly lies. King Charles, now in the later years of his life and continuing to manage the demands of royal duty alongside personal health challenges, has faced enormous pressure during his reign. Since ascending the throne, he has worked to maintain continuity while also attempting to modernize certain aspects of the institution. Yet the scale of the Andrew scandal created a situation that demanded swift, decisive action. And according to several royal observers, Prince William was ready. For years, the Prince of Wales has been known for his pragmatic approach to the monarchy's future. Unlike previous generations, he has openly acknowledged that the institution must adapt to a changing world. Public expectations of transparency and accountability are far greater today than they were decades ago. In William's view, the monarchy cannot survive if it appears unwilling to confront difficult realities within its own ranks. That philosophy began to shape the palace's response. As news of Andrew's arrest continued to dominate headlines, discussions inside the royal household turned toward one crucial objective: protecting the credibility of the crown. Advisors understood that the monarchy's strength has always depended on public trust. Without that trust, the institution's ceremonial role could quickly become politically vulnerable. William reportedly emphasized that point in private conversations with senior staff. According to sources familiar with the discussions, he argued that the monarchy had to demonstrate a clear and unmistakable break from any figure whose actions threatened its integrity. The strategy was not merely about managing public relations. It was about drawing a line that the public could clearly see. In practical terms, this meant reinforcing the separation between Andrew and the working members of the royal family. Titles that once carried prestige now appeared as liabilities. Residences associated with royal privilege became subjects of debate. Even long-standing personal connections were scrutinized through the lens of reputational risk. The message, insiders say, was unmistakable. The survival of the monarchy would always come before the protection of any individual member. This stance did not emerge without tension. Royal families, like all families, are bound by deep personal relationships. Loyalty, tradition, and shared history can complicate decisions that appear straightforward from the outside. For King Charles, the situation was especially painful. Andrew is not merely a public figure. He is also the king's brother. Balancing personal ties with institutional responsibility is never simple. Yet the crisis demanded clarity. As the days passed, the pattern became increasingly visible to those observing the monarchy closely. Public appearances were carefully arranged to project stability. Communications from the palace emphasized responsibility and accountability, and within strategic discussions about the future of the institution, Prince William's influence appeared stronger than ever. To many analysts, this moment marked more than just another royal scandal. It signaled the beginning of a deeper transformation, a shift in how the monarchy prepares for the future. Because while King Charles remains the sovereign, the next era of the crown is no longer a distant possibility. In the midst of crisis, it is already beginning to take shape. And at the center of that emerging era stands the Prince of Wales, preparing to lead an institution that must prove it can survive the challenges of a very different world. Long before the current crisis erupted into public view, there were already quiet warnings circulating within the inner circles of the royal household. Those warnings did not come from journalists or political commentators. They came from inside the institution itself, from aides, advisors, and members of the family who had begun to sense that the situation surrounding Andrew Mountbatten Windsor could one day become a serious threat to the monarchy's credibility. Among those voices, one figure was particularly persistent: Prince William. According to several royal commentators and former palace staff, William had been deeply uneasy about the reputational risks surrounding Andrew for many years. While the Duke of York had long held a prominent position within royal life, his associations and business dealings had increasingly attracted scrutiny from the press. What began as uncomfortable headlines gradually evolved into something far more damaging. Within palace discussions, the concern was never only about legal implications, it was about perception. In a constitutional monarchy where legitimacy depends heavily on public respect, even the appearance of impropriety can create long-lasting damage. William understood this reality perhaps more clearly than many others. As the son of Princess Diana and the future king of the United Kingdom, William grew up under intense public observation. From an early age, he witnessed how rapidly public sentiment could shift and how fragile royal reputation could be when scandals dominate the news cycle. The lessons of the past, particularly the turbulent years surrounding his parents' marriage and the aftermath of Diana's death, left a lasting impression on him. By the time William reached adulthood, he had developed a cautious and strategic view of how the monarchy should navigate modern media scrutiny. Those close to him say that he believes the institution survives not through blind tradition, but through carefully maintained trust between the crown and the public. That belief shaped his response when Andrew's controversies began to escalate. Several royal insiders have suggested that, after the now infamous interview given by Andrew to a major British broadcaster, an appearance widely criticized for its tone and lack of accountability, William became convinced that the monarchy needed to act far more decisively. The interview, intended to repair Andrew's reputation, instead deepened public outrage and intensified media investigation. Inside the palace, reactions to the interview were reportedly mixed. Some advisors urged patience, arguing that the situation might calm if Andrew stepped back quietly from public life. Others feared that taking harsh action against a senior royal could create its own controversy, potentially dividing the family and inviting further scrutiny. William's position was different. According to royal biographers, he argued that the greater danger lay in hesitation. Every moment of delay, he believed, risked giving the impression that the monarchy was reluctant to hold its own members accountable. In the long run, that perception could erode public confidence far more severely than any single scandal. Protecting the integrity of the crown, William reportedly insisted, had to come before protecting individual reputations. At the time, those warnings were not universally embraced. Queen Elizabeth II, who was still on the throne during the early stages of the controversy, faced a deeply personal dilemma. Andrew was not only a public figure under scrutiny, but also her son. The monarch had always maintained a strong commitment to family loyalty, and removing a royal from duties carried emotional as well as institutional consequences. Prince Charles, then the Prince of Wales, also found himself caught between competing pressures. On one hand, he recognized the reputational risks posed by the situation. On the other, the complexities of royal protocol and family relationships made decisive action difficult. For a time, the palace chose a cautious approach. Andrew withdrew from certain public engagements and attempted to reduce his visibility. Official statements emphasized that he would step back from royal responsibilities while the situation unfolded. The hope among senior advisors was that time, distance, and discretion might eventually allow the controversy to fade. But William remained skeptical. Those close to him say that he privately warned that the issue was far from resolved. The global media landscape had changed dramatically over the previous decades. Scandals no longer faded quietly into the background. Instead, digital archives, investigative journalism, and relentless online commentary ensured that controversial stories could resurface again and again. From William's perspective, the monarchy needed to address the problem at its root, rather than simply waiting for public attention to move elsewhere. Years later, the events now unfolding appear to confirm many of his earlier concerns. The arrest of Andrew has revived every unanswered question surrounding his past associations and decisions. The headlines dominating international news today mirror the warnings that William once voiced behind closed doors. What was once seen as a reputational risk has now evolved into a full-scale institutional crisis. For the Prince of Wales, this moment represents more than vindication. It represents responsibility. As heir to the throne, William understands that the monarchy he will one day inherit must be strong enough to withstand intense scrutiny in a democratic society. The public no longer accepts unquestioned privilege. Citizens expect transparency, accountability, and clear standards of conduct from anyone representing national institutions. This is the environment in which the future king is preparing to lead. Observers who study William's leadership style often note that he approaches royal duty with a mindset shaped by both tradition and modern governance. While he respects the historical role of the monarchy, he also recognizes that the institution must adapt if it hopes to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. In practical terms, that philosophy means confronting uncomfortable realities rather than avoiding them. The Andrew crisis has therefore become a defining test. How the monarchy responds will influence not only public perception today, but also the foundation upon which William's future reign will be built. A weak response could reinforce critics, who argue that the institution protects its own at the expense of accountability. A decisive response, however, could signal that the monarchy is capable of reform when circumstances demand it. This is why William's voice has grown increasingly influential during the current crisis. He is not simply observing events unfold. He is shaping the direction of the response. To many inside the palace, the message he has consistently delivered is both simple and uncompromising. The monarchy cannot afford to carry the weight of scandal into the future, and if protecting the crown requires difficult decisions, those decisions must be made no matter how uncomfortable they may be for the family itself. As the consequences of Andrew's arrest continue to ripple through the institution, the prince who once warned of the danger now finds himself responsible for guiding the monarchy through one of its most delicate moments in recent history. In doing so, he is also defining the kind of king he intends to become. For King Charles III, the path to the throne was longer than that of any monarch before him. For decades, he lived in the unusual position of being the heir apparent, waiting patiently while history unfolded around him. His life was defined by preparation, by learning the rhythms of royal duty, and by observing how the crown navigated the changing expectations of the modern world. When he finally became king, many believed that his years of preparation would allow him to guide the monarchy through a new era of thoughtful reform. Yet the reality of his reign has been far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Charles ascended the throne at a stage in life when most leaders have already established their legacy. The transition from Prince of Wales to sovereign happened at a moment when global attention toward the royal family was already intense. Every public appearance, every statement, and every decision was examined not only as the action of a new monarch, but as the opening chapter of an entirely new phase in British royal history. Almost immediately, Charles faced the difficult task of balancing continuity with change. On one hand, the monarchy depends on tradition to maintain its symbolic power. Ceremonies, rituals, and protocols create a sense of permanence that connects the present to centuries of history. On the other hand, the modern world demands institutions that are transparent, responsive, and accountable to the public. Charles understood this tension well. Throughout his earlier life, he had often spoken about modernization within the monarchy. As Prince of Wales, he had advocated for a slimmed-down royal family that would focus on a smaller number of working members representing the crown. His vision suggested that the institution should adapt to a society that increasingly questioned privilege and hereditary influence. However, the transition from vision to reality proved challenging. Not long after becoming king, Charles confronted a personal challenge that reshaped the rhythm of his reign. The announcement of his cancer diagnosis created immediate concern across the United Kingdom and beyond. While the palace initially reassured the public that the king remained committed to fulfilling his duties, it was clear that the situation would inevitably affect the pace at which he could govern the institution. Health challenges bring with them not only physical limitations but also a shift in perspective. For a monarch whose reign began later in life, the awareness of time carries a different meaning. Every decision becomes more urgent, every reform more consequential. In the months following his diagnosis, Charles continued to perform many of his ceremonial responsibilities, appearing at official events and delivering public messages designed to reassure the nation that stability remained intact. Yet behind the scenes, the structure of royal decision-making began to evolve. Prince William's role grew steadily more prominent. This evolution was not announced formally, nor was it framed as a transfer of authority. Instead, it unfolded through a series of subtle but meaningful developments. Meetings involving senior palace advisors increasingly included the Prince of Wales. Strategic discussions about the monarchy's future incorporated William's perspectives alongside those of the king's long-standing aides. In many ways, this shift represented a practical adaptation to circumstances. The demands placed on a modern monarch are immense. From diplomatic engagements to charitable initiatives, the responsibilities associated with the crown extend far beyond ceremonial appearances. With Charles balancing these obligations alongside ongoing medical treatment, the involvement of the heir became both logical and necessary. Yet observers began to notice something deeper than logistical cooperation. William was not merely assisting his father. He was emerging as a central figure in shaping the monarchy's strategic direction. Several developments illustrated this growing influence. One of the most significant involved the authority to grant royal warrants endorsements that allow businesses to advertise their association with the royal household. Historically, such privileges were tightly controlled by the monarch. Granting them symbolized trust, prestige, and direct recognition from the crown itself. When Charles extended this authority to William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, many analysts viewed the decision as a sign of generational transition. It suggested that the future leadership of the monarchy was already beginning to take form. Beyond symbolic gestures, William's involvement in major institutional decisions became increasingly visible. Discussions about how to respond to reputational threats, how to modernize royal operations, and how to present the monarchy to a younger generation often included his perspective at an early stage. Those who study the royal household describe the situation as a form of shared leadership. Charles remains the sovereign, the constitutional head of the monarchy whose authority derives from centuries of tradition and legal precedent. Yet William has become a powerful voice within the institution's inner circle, representing the next chapter of royal leadership. This dynamic reflects a broader reality about the nature of monarchy in the modern age. Unlike elected governments, where leadership changes are abrupt and defined by electoral cycles, royal institutions evolve gradually. The transition from one generation to the next is rarely marked by a single decisive moment. Instead, it emerges through overlapping responsibilities, mentorship, and the slow transfer of influence from parent to heir. For Charles and William, that process now appears to be accelerating. The Andrew crisis has played a major role in this acceleration. Moments of scandal test the resilience of institutions and force leaders to confront difficult decisions quickly. In such moments, the clarity of leadership becomes particularly important. Charles, facing both public pressure and personal health challenges, has relied increasingly on the support and judgment of his son. William, in turn, has demonstrated a willingness to take on responsibilities that extend beyond the traditional expectations of an heir. Their partnership has therefore become a defining feature of the current royal landscape. To outside observers, the arrangement raises intriguing questions. Is the monarchy witnessing the early stages of a generational handover, or is this simply a pragmatic adaptation to an extraordinary moment in royal history? The answer may lie somewhere between those possibilities. What is clear is that the relationship between king and heir has taken on new significance during this period of uncertainty. While Charles continues to embody the continuity of the crown, William increasingly represents its future direction. And as the monarchy navigates the consequences of scandal, shifting public expectations, and the pressures of a changing world, the balance between those two roles will shape the institution's destiny. For the first time in many years, the future of the crown no longer feels distant. It feels close, immediate, and already in motion. If Prince William's growing influence inside the monarchy represents a shift in leadership, it also reflects something deeper. A vision for how the institution must evolve in order to survive the modern age. For generations, the British monarchy operated through traditions that had changed very little over time. Authority flowed through well-established hierarchies. Decisions were often shaped by senior courtiers, working quietly behind palace doors, and the public saw only carefully choreographed appearances that reinforced the image of continuity. That system allowed the monarchy to maintain stability during centuries of political and social change. But the world surrounding the crown has transformed dramatically. Modern societies demand transparency from institutions that represent them. Citizens expect accountability, ethical conduct, and a clear sense that power is exercised responsibly. In this environment, the monarchy can no longer rely solely on tradition to maintain its legitimacy. It must demonstrate that it understands the expectations of the era in which it exists. Prince William has long appeared aware of this reality. Those who have worked closely with him often describe his leadership style as unusually pragmatic for a member of the royal family. While he respects the symbolic importance of royal heritage, he also approaches the monarchy with a mindset shaped by contemporary organizational thinking. Rather than seeing the institution as a purely ceremonial structure, he has frequently spoken about the need for it to operate with the efficiency and clarity expected of modern institutions. In practical terms, this means rethinking how the royal household is managed. One of the clearest examples of William's approach can be seen in the way he and Catherine have structured their charitable work. The Royal Foundation, which they oversee together, functions in many ways like a modern nonprofit organization rather than a traditional royal patronage. It operates with a clearly defined leadership structure that includes a chief executive officer, a governing board, and measurable objectives for each initiative it supports. Regular updates are shared with the public, and projects are evaluated based on their tangible impact rather than simply their ceremonial value. For William, this model represents more than an effective way to manage charitable programs. It offers a blueprint for how the broader monarchy might operate in the future. Instead of relying heavily on informal traditions and long-established customs, the institution could adopt clearer systems of accountability and professional management. Responsibilities within the royal household could be defined more explicitly. Decision-making processes could become more transparent, and the public could see more clearly how royal initiatives contribute to social causes. Such changes would represent a significant departure from the way the monarchy has historically functioned. Yet William appears convinced that modernization is necessary if the crown hopes to remain relevant to future generations. Younger citizens, in particular, often view inherited privilege with skepticism. In their eyes, institutions must demonstrate their value through meaningful contributions to society rather than simply through historical prestige. This perspective helps explain why William has repeatedly emphasized the importance of public service in defining the role of the royal family. To him, the monarchy's legitimacy rests on its ability to serve as a unifying symbol while also supporting initiatives that address real challenges faced by communities across the United Kingdom and the wider Commonwealth. However, translating this philosophy into action has not been without resistance. Inside the royal household, traditions carry enormous weight. Many courtiers and advisors have spent their careers preserving practices that have guided the monarchy for decades. To them, rapid changes could risk undermining the very stability that makes the institution valuable. Even within the royal family itself, not every member shares the same enthusiasm for structural reform. Some believe that the monarchy's strength lies precisely in its continuity. They argue that while modernization is important, it must occur gradually and carefully so that the institution does not lose the sense of timelessness that distinguishes it from other organizations. Balancing these perspectives requires careful leadership. William appears aware that pushing for reform too aggressively could create internal friction or alienate those who see themselves as guardians of royal tradition. At the same time, failing to adapt could leave the monarchy vulnerable to criticism from a public increasingly skeptical of institutions perceived as outdated. This delicate balance has shaped the way William speaks about change. Rather than presenting modernization as a radical break from the past, he often frames it as a natural evolution of the monarchy's historic mission. The crown, he suggests, has always adapted to the needs of the nation across different eras. From constitutional reforms to shifts in public engagement, the institution has survived precisely because it found ways to evolve without abandoning its core identity. In William's view, the current moment represents another chapter in that long process of adaptation. The Andrew crisis has intensified the urgency of this transformation. Scandals that might once have faded quietly now spread instantly across global media platforms. Every misstep becomes a viral headline, and every perceived failure of accountability invites fierce public criticism. In such an environment, the monarchy must demonstrate that it takes integrity seriously. For William, this means setting clear standards about who represents the crown and under what conditions. The idea that royal status alone should guarantee lifelong privilege no longer fits comfortably within the expectations of modern democratic societies. Instead, he appears to believe that royal responsibility must be matched by conduct that upholds the dignity of the institution. Those who fail to meet that standard, regardless of family connections, cannot continue to represent the monarchy without consequences. This philosophy has begun to influence discussions about the future structure of the royal family. A smaller group of working royals, carefully selected and held to high standards of conduct, could create a clearer public image of responsibility and professionalism. Such a model would place greater emphasis on merit, service, and accountability, rather than simply on lineage. If this vision eventually becomes reality, it could reshape how the monarchy functions for decades to come. Yet achieving that transformation will require navigating not only public expectations, but also the complex relationships within the royal family itself. Because while William's vision for a modernized monarchy may appeal to many observers outside the palace walls, implementing it inside one of the world's oldest institutions is never a simple task. And as the monarchy continues to confront the consequences of scandal and shifting public attitudes, the tension between tradition and reform will remain one of the defining challenges of its future. Yet even the most carefully designed plans for reform rarely unfold without resistance. Inside the royal household, where tradition is woven into nearly every aspect of daily life, changes to the structure or culture of the monarchy can provoke quiet but powerful opposition. For Prince William, whose vision for modernization is becoming increasingly clear, that resistance has emerged from an unexpected place. Queen Camilla. For many observers, Camilla's role within the royal family has always been complex. Her path into the monarchy was shaped by decades of controversy, public scrutiny, and gradual acceptance. When she eventually became queen consort, it symbolized not only a personal milestone but also a transformation in how the public viewed her relationship with King Charles. Over time, Camilla worked carefully to build her own identity within the institution. She focused on charitable work, particularly initiatives supporting victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Through public engagements and quiet advocacy, she gradually developed a reputation as a committed and hardworking member of the royal family. Yet the current crisis surrounding Andrew has placed her in a difficult position. According to several royal observers, tensions between Camilla and Prince William have grown more noticeable as discussions about the monarchy's future have intensified. While the disagreements have remained largely private, the underlying issues reveal a broader divide between different visions for how the institution should respond to scandal and reform. At the center of the conflict lies a sensitive question about loyalty and association. Camilla has maintained a long-standing friendship with Sarah Ferguson, the former wife of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Their relationship predates many of the controversies that now surround Andrew's name. For Camilla, that friendship represents decades of personal connection that existed long before the current crisis unfolded. But from William's perspective, the situation looks very different. In the environment of modern media scrutiny, relationships themselves can become symbols. Associations with individuals linked to scandal, even indirectly, can raise uncomfortable questions about judgment and accountability. For a monarchy already struggling to protect its credibility, such connections can create reputational risks that are difficult to ignore. This is where William's philosophy of reform begins to clash with Camilla's sense of loyalty. Those close to palace discussions suggest that William believes the royal family must draw a clear and unmistakable boundary between the institution and anyone associated with damaging controversies. In his view, ambiguity creates confusion. The public must see that the monarchy is willing to separate itself completely from figures whose actions have undermined trust. Camilla, however, appears to see the matter through a more personal lens. For someone who spent years rebuilding her own public image, the idea of abandoning longtime friends because of external pressure may feel both unfair and unnecessarily harsh. Personal relationships inside royal circles often span decades, surviving political changes, media storms, and shifts in public opinion. Breaking those ties is not simply a strategic decision, it is an emotional one. This difference in perspective has gradually created friction between the two figures. William's approach emphasizes institutional protection above all else. Every decision must serve the long-term credibility of the crown. If distancing the monarchy from controversial figures strengthens public confidence, then that step must be taken without hesitation. Camilla's approach reflects a more traditional understanding of loyalty. Personal relationships, particularly those formed long before public controversies emerged, carry their own weight and significance. To her, loyalty is not something that should be abandoned lightly. When these two philosophies collide, the result is a subtle but unmistakable tension. Royal insiders have occasionally hinted that discussions about how to handle the Andrew crisis have included disagreements about the extent to which the monarchy should distance itself from individuals within its wider social circle. For William, the solution appears straightforward. The line between the crown and scandal must be absolute. For Camilla, the issue is more nuanced. These disagreements have been further complicated by the broader context of generational change within the monarchy. William represents the future, a younger leader preparing to guide the institution through a media landscape far more aggressive than anything previous generations experienced. Camilla, by contrast, emerged from an era when royal controversies were managed through patience, discretion, and gradual damage control. Both perspectives are shaped by the times in which they developed. In earlier decades, the royal family could rely on a more restrained media environment. Stories moved slowly, public attention shifted more easily, and private relationships rarely became the subject of relentless digital scrutiny. Today, the situation is entirely different. Information spreads instantly across social platforms, international news networks, and online communities that analyze every detail of royal behavior. In this environment, even the smallest symbolic gesture can become a headline. William understands this reality deeply. As someone who grew up under the most intense form of global media attention imaginable, he recognizes that the monarchy cannot afford ambiguous signals when public trust is at stake. For him, the Andrew crisis represents a moment that demands clarity. Camilla, however, must balance that demand with her own role as queen consort. Her position requires her to support the king while also preserving the relationships and alliances that have shaped royal life for decades. Navigating these expectations while facing criticism from both the media and internal palace debates places her in a uniquely challenging situation. The result is a delicate power dynamic unfolding within the palace. On the surface, the monarchy continues to present a united front. Public appearances remain carefully coordinated, official statements emphasize stability, and the institution projects the image of continuity that has defined it for centuries. But beneath that carefully managed exterior, an important conversation is taking place. It is a conversation about how far the monarchy must go to protect its reputation, how quickly it should adapt to modern expectations, and how personal loyalty should be weighed against institutional survival. For Prince William, the answer is increasingly clear. The future of the crown depends on its ability to demonstrate integrity without compromise. For Queen Camilla, the situation is more complicated. Loyalty, history, and personal relationships cannot simply be erased in the name of public perception. As these competing perspectives continue to shape the palace's internal discussions, one truth becomes evident. The monarchy is no longer simply navigating a scandal. It is navigating the difficult transition between two generations and two very different ideas about what the crown must become in order to endure. If the disagreements between Prince William and Queen Camilla reveal a divide in philosophy, another dynamic inside the royal household has been drawing even greater attention. Quietly, steadily, and often away from the spotlight, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has become one of the most influential figures shaping how the monarchy responds to the current crisis. For many years, Catherine built her public image through patience and restraint. When she first entered the royal family, commentators frequently described her as careful, composed, and intensely aware of the responsibility that came with representing the crown. She rarely stepped beyond the traditional boundaries expected of a royal consort. Instead, she focused on charitable initiatives, family life, and the long process of learning the rhythms of royal duty. Yet moments of crisis often reveal new dimensions of leadership. As the controversy surrounding Andrew intensified and public scrutiny of the monarchy reached new levels, Catherine's role began to expand in subtle but significant ways. Palace insiders have increasingly described her not simply as the Prince of Wales's partner, but as a strategic presence within the royal household. Part of that influence comes from the unique partnership she shares with Prince William. Unlike earlier royal marriages that sometimes operated within rigid ceremonial roles, William and Catherine are widely seen as working collaborators. Their public projects, charitable initiatives, and long-term goals are often developed together. Over time, this partnership has allowed Catherine to participate more directly in discussions about how the monarchy should engage with the public and navigate moments of difficulty. During the current crisis, that collaboration has become especially visible. Behind the scenes, Catherine has reportedly worked closely with palace advisors to help shape the monarchy's response to the growing controversy. This work involves careful coordination between communications teams, legal consultants, and senior staff responsible for managing royal engagements. In a modern media environment where every statement can be dissected within minutes, the way the palace communicates during a crisis is critically important. Those involved in the process say Catherine approaches these responsibilities with a calm, analytical mindset. Rather than reacting emotionally to headlines or social media commentary, she tends to focus on long-term perception. How will today's decisions affect the monarchy's reputation tomorrow? What signals are being sent through public appearances? How can the royal family demonstrate stability at a moment when public confidence may be wavering? These questions have guided many of the choices made during recent weeks. Observers have noted that Catherine's presence beside William at key public engagements has carried symbolic weight. While the palace rarely explains the reasoning behind such appearances, the visual message is unmistakable. Together, they represent continuity, unity, and the next generation of royal leadership. In times of uncertainty, symbols matter. For the public, the image of the Prince and Princess of Wales working side by side conveys reassurance that the monarchy remains stable despite internal tensions. Their partnership suggests that the institution's future is already being shaped by leaders who understand both its traditions and the challenges of the modern era. This growing influence, however, has not gone unnoticed within the royal household. For Queen Camilla, Catherine's increasing role may feel like a delicate balancing act. As queen consort, Camilla occupies the highest position among the women of the royal family. Her responsibilities include supporting the king, representing the crown at official events, and maintaining the dignity associated with her title. Yet the emergence of Catherine as a central figure in crisis management can create the impression that the younger generation is stepping forward with greater authority. From one perspective, this development reflects the natural evolution of monarchy. Every generation gradually assumes more responsibility as the next era approaches. The Prince and Princess of Wales are preparing for roles that will one day place them at the center of national life. Their involvement in major decisions is therefore both expected and necessary. From another perspective, however, the shift can produce tension. Palace insiders have occasionally hinted that Camilla feels uncomfortable when Catherine becomes deeply involved in matters traditionally handled by senior advisors or by the king's immediate circle. The concern is not simply about hierarchy, but about perception. If the public begins to see Catherine as the driving force behind key decisions, it could unintentionally overshadow the authority of the reigning monarch and his consort. King Charles himself appears to view the situation differently. According to several royal observers, he has consistently defended Catherine's involvement, describing her contributions as supportive rather than intrusive. In his view, the strength of the monarchy has always depended on cooperation between generations. Allowing William and Catherine to take on greater responsibility ensures that the institution remains prepared for the future. This perspective reflects Charles's broader understanding of royal continuity. Monarchies survive not by freezing time, but by allowing each generation to adapt the institution to new circumstances. The presence of William and Catherine within strategic discussions about the monarchy's direction may therefore represent a practical form of preparation rather than a challenge to existing authority. Still, the emotional dynamics within any family can be complicated. The royal household, despite its global visibility and ceremonial grandeur, remains a family bound by personal relationships, loyalties, and rivalries. Navigating those relationships while managing the expectations of an entire nation requires extraordinary diplomacy. Catherine's approach has often been described as precisely that: diplomatic, measured, and quietly effective. She rarely engages in public disputes or responds directly to speculation about tensions within the palace. Instead, she focuses on the work in front of her, strengthening charitable initiatives, supporting William's vision for a modern monarchy, and maintaining the composed image that has become one of her defining traits. Through this steady approach, she has gradually become more than a supportive partner to the heir. She has become one of the figures most closely associated with the future of the crown. As the monarchy continues to navigate scandal, shifting public expectations, and internal debate, Catherine's presence alongside William sends a clear signal about the direction in which the institution is moving. The era currently unfolding may still belong formally to King Charles, but the leadership style, values, and partnerships that will define the next chapter of the monarchy are already beginning to take shape. As the crisis surrounding Andrew continues to unfold, the events taking place within the royal household are beginning to reveal something larger than a single scandal. What is happening behind the palace walls is not simply a response to controversy. It is the gradual reshaping of an institution that has existed for centuries, but now faces pressures unlike any in its past. The British monarchy has always survived by adapting. Throughout history, it has endured wars, political upheavals, social revolutions, and dramatic cultural change. Each generation of monarchs has been forced to adjust the institution's role in order to maintain public support. The crown's ability to evolve without losing its symbolic continuity has been one of the central reasons it has remained relevant for so long. Now the monarchy stands at another moment of transition. The challenges confronting it today are not only legal or personal, they are structural and generational. Public expectations about transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership are higher than ever. Citizens who support the monarchy often do so because they believe it represents national unity and moral stability. When scandals threaten that perception, the consequences can be profound. This is why the response to the Andrew crisis carries such significance. For Prince William, the situation reinforces his belief that the monarchy must become smaller, more focused, and more disciplined in the way it represents itself to the public. The idea of a streamlined royal family, a group of working members carefully selected for their dedication to service, has been discussed for many years. Under William's future leadership, that concept may move from theory into reality. Such a model would mark a clear departure from earlier eras when a wider circle of royal relatives participated in official duties. Instead, representation of the crown would likely be limited to those who consistently demonstrate both professionalism and public trust. In this vision of the future, royal status alone would no longer guarantee a prominent role within the institution. Responsibility would matter more than lineage. William has reportedly told close associates that the survival of the monarchy depends on maintaining the highest possible standards among those who represent it. The public must feel confident that every individual appearing in the name of the crown reflects the values the institution claims to uphold. If that confidence disappears, the symbolic authority of the monarchy could begin to erode. The Andrew scandal has therefore become a powerful reminder of the risks associated with reputational damage. It demonstrates how quickly controversies involving a single figure can affect the entire institution. For William and those who share his perspective, preventing similar situations in the future requires stronger internal boundaries and clearer expectations for royal conduct. Yet reforming an institution as old as the monarchy is never a simple task. Tradition carries enormous emotional and historical significance. Many citizens value the crown precisely because it represents continuity across generations. Any attempt to modernize its structure must therefore proceed carefully, ensuring that reforms strengthen rather than weaken the institution's symbolic identity. Balancing these priorities will be one of the defining challenges of William's future reign. When that moment eventually arrives, he will inherit not only the throne but also the responsibility of guiding the monarchy through an era defined by rapid social and technological change. The relationship between the crown and the public will continue to evolve, shaped by new expectations about leadership, accountability, and national identity. Alongside him, Catherine will likely play a central role in shaping how the monarchy presents itself to the world. Her steady approach to public duty, combined with her ability to connect with a wide range of communities, has already helped strengthen the image of the Prince and Princess of Wales as representatives of the monarchy's next chapter. Together, they symbolize a partnership that blends tradition with a more contemporary understanding of royal responsibility. For King Charles, watching this transition unfold may carry a mixture of pride and reflection. His reign began with the challenge of honoring the legacy of the late Queen while also guiding the monarchy into a new era. Now, as circumstances accelerate the involvement of the next generation, he finds himself overseeing a process that has always been inevitable: the gradual preparation of his successor. The crown still rests firmly upon his head, but the shape of the monarchy that will follow him is already becoming visible. The influence of Prince William continues to grow. The presence of Catherine beside him signals the emergence of a new partnership at the center of royal life, and the institution itself is beginning to adjust to a future in which accountability, professionalism, and public trust will determine its long-term survival. History rarely announces its turning points with certainty. They emerge slowly, through crises, decisions, and moments when leadership reveals itself under pressure. The events now unfolding within the royal household may one day be remembered as one of those moments, the period when the monarchy began preparing, quietly but unmistakably, for the era that lies ahead. What began as a scandal surrounding one royal figure has gradually revealed something far more significant inside the British monarchy. Beneath the headlines, a deeper transformation is quietly unfolding. The arrest of Andrew forced the institution to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, reputation, and the standards expected of those who represent the crown. But it also exposed the shifting balance of influence within the royal family itself. King Charles remains the sovereign, the symbol of continuity and tradition that the monarchy has always relied upon. Yet the pressures of the modern era, combined with the realities of leadership in later life, have created space for the next generation to step forward. Prince William's voice has grown stronger, his vision for a more accountable and disciplined monarchy increasingly shaping the direction of the institution. At the same time, Catherine's presence beside him reflects the emergence of a partnership that many believe will define the future of the crown. Together, they represent a monarchy preparing to adapt without abandoning its history. The transition is not official, and the throne has not changed hands. But moments of crisis often accelerate change in ways that formal ceremonies never can. And within the palace, it has become clear that the future of the monarchy is no longer a distant chapter waiting to begin. It is already taking shape. The grand tapestries and ancient stone corridors of the British monarchy have witnessed centuries of calculated whispers and silent successions, yet nothing could have prepared the institution for the earthquake that recently rattled its very foundations. To the outside world, the transition of power appeared as a rehearsed ballet of tradition, a smooth and united front, with Prince William stepping toward his destiny, flanked by the unwavering support of the royal household. But behind those heavy, gilded doors, a far more dangerous reality was unfolding, a quiet internal war marked by divided loyalties and surgical maneuvers that no one saw coming. The most disciplined and duty-bound member of the family, Princess Anne, has just executed a move so bold and so final that it has sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of global power. Without raising her voice or making a single public declaration, she has effectively altered the course of royal history. For weeks, the machinery of the palace had been humming with the intricate preparations for the future, specifically the coronation planning for the Prince of Wales. In this high-stakes environment, information is the ultimate currency, and invitations to strategy meetings are the markers of true authority. However, as confidential briefings and high-level memos began to circulate among the inner circle, a glaring omission became impossible to ignore. One name was missing from every document, every digital thread, and every secure briefing. Queen Consort Camilla had been quietly, systematically, and completely cut out. This was not a clerical error or a scheduling oversight. It was a deliberate act of exclusion, carried out with a level of precision that only someone with the stature of the Princess Royal could command. The shock of this exclusion was magnified by the way it was discovered. There was no formal meeting to explain the change, no official notice sent to her offices at Clarence House. Instead, the Queen Consort found out by accident. Members of her own loyal staff, confused by the sudden silence from the planning committees, reportedly questioned why a key memo, one that should have crossed her desk automatically, never arrived. That was the moment the mask of palace unity slipped, revealing a deep and jagged rift. The emotional impact was immediate and severe. Those close to the situation describe a sense of profound betrayal, not just by a sister-in-law, but by the very system Camilla believed she had finally conquered through years of patient image repair and service. The message echoed through the ancient halls with chilling clarity. The firm had drawn a new boundary, and the queen consort was standing firmly on the wrong side of it. While the public sees a family united in grief and duty, the internal reality is a power struggle of epic proportions. Princess Anne has long been the steady, unmovable force of the monarchy, and her decision to block Camilla from the inner sanctum of William's future reign suggests a seismic shift in the royal hierarchy. Was this a protective shield thrown around a future king, or the final eruption of a tension that has been simmering for decades? As we peel back the layers of this royal drama, we must ask, what finally pushed the most stoic princess in history to take such an uncompromising stand? And is this the beginning of a permanent exile for the woman currently wearing the crown? One thing is certain, the battle for the future of the monarchy has begun, and the rules of engagement have just been rewritten in the shadows. To understand the ferocity of this current divide, one must look beneath the polished surface of modern royal life and into the ironclad principles of the woman known as the monarchy's backbone. Princess Anne has never been one for the fleeting charms of public relations or the desperate chase for media approval. Her life is a testament to the old ways, a lifetime of service carried out with a quiet, unmovable discipline that demands respect from everyone within the palace walls. She is the steady force that keeps the heavy structure of the crown upright, and she expects nothing less than total devotion to tradition from those around her. This is why her tension with Queen Camilla was never a simple matter of personal dislike or petty rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies that has been building for more than 40 years. For Anne, the crown is a sacred burden, something that is worn through decades of silent sacrifice and unwavering adherence to rank. She watched as Camilla rose from the ashes of a public scandal to the position of queen consort, a journey powered not by the traditional path of service, but by a carefully managed campaign of image rehabilitation. To the Princess Royal, this felt like an erosion of the very principles she spent her life defending. While other senior members of the family made visible efforts to welcome Camilla into the fold, Anne remained a fortress of cool, distant politeness. She limited her interactions to what protocol strictly required, offering no warm gestures or public displays of affection. It was a measured silence that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read the language of the court. Anne believes deeply that status within the firm must be earned through a lifetime of work, not reshaped by public sympathy or clever media strategies. Insiders recall a private moment following a summer event at Balmoral that perfectly captures this divide. Anne is said to have remarked to a trusted confidant that some people wear the crown for duty, while others wear it merely for appearance. Though she mentioned no names, everyone in the room knew exactly who she was referencing. This belief only intensified when her brother ascended the throne. Anne watched with increasing concern as Camilla's influence appeared to grow at a rapid pace. The queen consort became more assertive in protocol discussions and more vocal during ceremonial planning. To the world, it might have looked like a woman coming into her own, but to Anne, it was a dangerous overreach. She saw a woman attempting to rewrite her role in the monarchy rather than accepting the strict limits that tradition imposes on a consort. The tension was not just psychological, it manifested in sharp, physical corrections that few outsiders truly noticed. At one high-profile diplomatic reception, Camilla reportedly attempted to take the lead in a conversation with a foreign envoy, a role traditionally reserved for the sovereign or those born into the bloodline. Anne did not hesitate for a single second. She firmly interrupted the exchange, redirecting the conversation herself and subtly putting the queen consort back in her place. It was not an act of cruelty in Anne's mind, but a necessary structural correction. She viewed these moments as a defense of the institution itself. Behind closed doors, she began to voice her concerns that the hierarchy was being blurred by those who did not truly respect the weight of the history they were stepping into. This long, simmering friction reached a boiling point as the planning for the next generation began. Anne began holding private, confidential audiences with Prince William, sharing her fears that the line between symbolic support and real influence was becoming dangerously thin. She warned the future king that if Camilla were allowed to shape the foundational decisions of his coronation and his future reign, the delicate balance of authority within the institution would be permanently destabilized. These conversations were not about punishment, they were about protection. Anne viewed Camilla's expanding presence not as a reinforcement of the throne, but as a potential challenge to its long-term survival. She was planting the seeds of a quiet revolution, convincing William that the future of the monarchy depended on his ability to stand alone, shielded by tradition rather than overshadowed by those who sought to rewrite their roles for the sake of public perception. Anne's message was final. The crown must remain a symbol of duty, and anyone who treated it as a stage for personal influence had to be stopped. The air inside the private sitting rooms of Clarence House has often been described by those who work there as heavy, thick, with the weight of centuries-old secrets and the lingering scent of beeswax and ancient wood. It is a place where history is not just remembered but lived, where every painting on the wall seems to watch the present with a critical, unforgiving eye. On a late afternoon just a few weeks ago, that heaviness reached a suffocating peak. Prince William did not enter the room as a grieving son or a polite stepson seeking a casual conversation over tea. He entered as the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, and a man who had finally decided that the polite fictions of the past could no longer survive the pressures of the future. The tension that had been building between him and Queen Camilla for years, a tension that had lived in the quiet spaces between forced smiles and rehearsed public appearances, was about to erupt into a confrontation that would redefine the hierarchy of the British monarchy. For William, this moment had been a long time coming. He had spent months watching from the sidelines as Camilla's influence within the palace began to shift from supportive to assertive. He saw it in the way she positioned herself in ceremonial photographs, the way she spoke with an increasing sense of ownership over palace protocol, and the way she seemed to be quietly carving out a legacy that William believed belonged only to those of the direct bloodline. To the public, William remained the picture of measured restraint, but behind closed doors, the pressure of protecting his future reign was becoming an unbearable burden. He realized that if he did not set a boundary now, the very identity of his future coronation would be diluted by the influence of a woman whose path to the crown was, in his eyes, fundamentally different from his own. When the two sat down, the silence was immediate and absolute. There were no pleasantries, no inquiries about the children or the king's health. William spoke first, his voice carrying the calm, cold authority of a man who had already made up his mind. He began by acknowledging the complexities of the current transition, but he quickly moved to the heart of the matter. He explained, with a courtesy that felt as sharp as a blade, that the planning for his own coronation was now underway in earnest. He made it clear that this event was not merely a continuation of the present, but a foundational statement for the future of the monarchy, his future. Therefore, he requested that Camilla step back from all key planning committees, particularly those involving the symbolic and ceremonial decisions that would define the visual and moral language of his reign. He was not asking for her opinion, he was informing her of a new reality. He spoke about the need for space, the need for the public to see a clear and distinct vision of the future king and queen. He argued that her presence in these specific, high-level strategy meetings was beginning to feel intrusive, a distraction from the message of continuity and renewal that he and Catherine were working so hard to cultivate. It was a request delivered with the kind of restraint that William had mastered over a lifetime of public scrutiny, yet the underlying message was undeniable. Her era was a bridge, and he was the destination. He wanted her to understand that while she was the queen consort today, she would not be the architect of tomorrow. Camilla, however, was not prepared to be lectured by the boy she had watched grow into a man. She had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of public opinion, fighting her way from the most hated woman in Britain to the side of the king. She believed she had earned her place at the table through endurance and loyalty, and she was not about to let the heir to the throne brush her aside like a temporary guest. As William spoke, she reportedly maintained a polite, almost glacial smile, but those close to her say her eyes remained fixed on him with a dangerous intensity. When he finished, she did not respond with anger or defensive arguments. Instead, she chose a weapon far more potent, dismissal. With a tone that blended soft amusement and a patronizing edge, she leaned forward and replied with a single, devastating sentence. "It is all symbolic tradition, darling, nothing more." To Camilla, she was perhaps trying to de-escalate the situation by making it seem as though William was overreacting to minor details. But to William, the word darling was a condescending slap in the face, and her dismissal of symbolic tradition was an insult to the very institution he was sworn to protect. It suggested that his future, his burden, and the sacred rituals of the crown were nothing more than a theatrical performance that she found quaint. That was the moment something in the Prince of Wales finally snapped. The years of suppressed resentment, the memories of his mother's pain, and the overwhelming weight of his current responsibilities converged into a single, explosive realization. There could be no middle ground. Breaking from his usual diplomatic restraint, William stood up, his presence filling the room with a sudden, sharp energy. He looked directly at the woman who had spent so long trying to win his favor, and delivered a sentence that insiders say still echoes through the corridors of the palace. "This is not your crown to shape." The words fell with a heavy, final thud. There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange of insults, just a silence so profound it felt as though the very walls of Clarence House were holding their breath. William did not wait for a response. He did not wait for an apology or an explanation. He simply turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floorboards. He had drawn the line in the sand, and he had done so with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. The very next day, William sought out the one person he knew would understand the gravity of what had just occurred. He met privately with Princess Anne, the only member of the family whose devotion to the crown surpassed even his own. He recounted the meeting, the dismissal, and the darling that had been the final straw. Anne did not need to be convinced. She saw in William's resolve the same iron discipline that she had lived by her entire life. Together, they formed a silent pact. The exclusion of Camilla from the coronation planning would no longer be a suggestion. It would be a coordinated, surgical reality. From that moment on, the palace machinery shifted gears. Meetings were rescheduled without Camilla's knowledge. Guest lists were vetted by William's personal advisors. Key strategy documents were rerouted through secure channels that bypassed her office entirely. It was a masterpiece of internal maneuvering, a realignment of power that happened so quietly and so efficiently that for several days, the queen consort had no idea she had been erased from the future. When she finally realized the extent of the betrayal, the fury that erupted within the walls of Clarence House was unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. But by then, the gates had already been closed. William had reclaimed his territory, and with Anne by his side, he had ensured that the crown he would one day wear would be shaped by his vision and his vision alone. The fight for the soul of the monarchy had moved into a new, more ruthless phase, and for the first time in her long journey, Camilla was finding herself on the outside looking in. The mechanics of power within the palace often operate like a clockwork engine, hidden, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. When Princess Anne and Prince William decided to move forward with the exclusion of Queen Camilla, they did not resort to public arguments or dramatic ultimatums. Instead, they utilized the very bureaucracy that Camilla had once used to secure her own position. This was the surgical exclusion, a strategic maneuver designed to erase her influence from the coronation planning without leaving a single fingerprint on the weapon. It was a masterpiece of internal statecraft, executed by a small, elite group of advisors who answered only to the bloodline royals. The first phase of the operation focused on the digital and physical flow of information. For months, Camilla's office at Clarence House had been part of every major email chain and distribution list regarding the transition. That changed within 48 hours of William's confrontation with her. A new, secondary layer of communication was established, one that excluded the Queen Consort's private secretaries and senior aides. Meeting agendas were quietly revised. The official calendar remained unchanged, but the real discussions were moved to private residences or secure rooms within Kensington Palace. When Camilla's team reached out for updates, they were met with polite, vague responses from William's staff, citing administrative delays or ongoing internal reviews. It was a classic case of being ghosted by the crown. Anne's role in this was instrumental. She understood the intricacies of palace protocol better than anyone alive. She knew exactly which documents required a consort's signature and which ones could be bypassed under the guise of sovereign prerogative. She guided William's team in rerouting sensitive correspondence through the Duchy of Cornwall channels, effectively shielding the plans from the eyes of those loyal to Camilla. Even the guest lists for the preliminary strategy sessions were scrutinized with a level of intensity usually reserved for state funerals. Every name was vetted for loyalty. If an individual was suspected of leaking information back to Camilla's circle, they were quietly reassigned to other duties or left off the invitation list entirely. The loyalty of William's inner circle was absolute. These were men and women who viewed themselves as the vanguard of a new era, and they saw Anne's leadership as the ultimate validation of their mission. They operated with a sense of purpose that made them immune to the subtle pressures usually exerted by the Queen Consort's office. When Camilla's senior advisors attempted to assert their authority, they found themselves hitting a wall of polite but immovable resistance. The young guard, as some palace insiders called them, were following a blueprint laid out by the Princess Royal herself, and they did so with a level of discretion that made it impossible for Camilla to mount a counteroffensive. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to a cold, creeping dread. Camilla's staff began to notice the subtle signs of their isolation. The phones, which usually rang with constant updates from the planning committees, grew quiet. Key invitations to working lunches failed to arrive. Memos that were once shared daily became weekly, then stopped altogether. It was a psychological war as much as a political one. The Queen Consort's aides, many of whom had spent years building her influence, found themselves standing on a shrinking island of relevance. They could see the horizon of the future, but they were no longer being invited to sail toward it. This was not merely about logistics. It was about the fundamental realignment of power. By cutting Camilla out of the coronation planning, Anne and William were sending a message to the entire royal household. The era of the consort's dominance was over. The authority now resided with the heir and the sister of the king. The surgical exclusion had worked perfectly. Camilla was still queen, she still wore the jewelry, and she still attended the public engagements. But in the rooms where the future was being written, her seat had been removed, and the door had been locked from the inside. The institution had corrected itself, and it had done so with a cold, terrifying efficiency that left no room for appeal. Through these silent maneuvers, the duo had ensured that the foundation of the next reign would be built on their terms, leaving the Queen Consort to wonder how she had lost the game she thought she had already won. As the whispers of Camilla's exclusion grew into a deafening silence within the palace walls, a different kind of presence began to take hold, one that did not need to shout to be heard. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, did not step into the void left by the Queen Consort with a flourish of trumpets or a demand for recognition. Instead, she occupied the space with a calm, effortless authority that felt as natural as the sunrise. While others were embroiled in a desperate struggle for influence, Catherine was quietly becoming the very heart of the operation. She did not ask for a seat at the table. The table was built around her. Senior palace staff later observed that her role in these early coronation meetings was far from symbolic. She was not there to simply nod and smile. She was there to lead, to refine, and to ground the future king in a reality that felt both ancient and entirely new. Catherine brought a vision to the table that was both deeply respectful of the past and boldly focused on the future. She understood that a coronation in the modern age could not merely be a repeat of centuries-old rituals. It had to resonate with a generation that viewed the monarchy with a skeptical eye. It was Catherine who suggested that young people from across the four nations should have a visible and active role in the procession, giving the future a literal place in the most sacred of moments. It was Catherine who proposed a way to honor the late Queen Elizabeth II that felt like a bridge rather than a ghost, blending the legacy of the longest reigning monarch with the fresh purpose of the new era. Her ideas were not forced. They were thoughtful, intentional, and perfectly aligned with the weight of the crown. The contrast between Catherine and Camilla was becoming impossible to ignore. Where Camilla's actions were increasingly viewed through the lens of strategy and overreach, Catherine moved with an ease that met no resistance. Her influence was not announced because it did not need to be. It was felt in every decision made and every tone set. Palace aides described the working relationship between William and Catherine as a partnership of equals, a rare occurrence in the history of the firm. Where William brought the necessary strength and historical gravity, Catherine brought a much-needed balance and a lightness of touch. They did not operate through rank or command. They operated through a shared vision. One insider noted that the two worked as if they were a single mind, moving toward a future that they were building together, brick by brick, without the need for external validation. Beyond the palace gates, the public's response to Catherine's ascent was quiet but undeniable. After years of scandal, internal rifts, and public fatigue, the people found a sense of grounding comfort in her presence. She felt authentic in a way that the carefully managed image of the Queen Consort never quite achieved. Catherine was polished, yet relatable, elegant without being aloof, and beautiful without the need to push herself into the center of the frame. Polling numbers, though rarely discussed openly within the inner circle, confirmed what the advisors already knew. The public was not responding to titles or bloodlines anymore. They were responding to character. Catherine was becoming the symbol of trust that the monarchy desperately needed to survive the coming decades. What made her rise even more striking was the total lack of competition. Catherine never tried to replace Camilla. She simply embodied what the monarchy was evolving toward. While the Queen Consort fought to remain seen, Catherine was content to be significant. She understood that in the language of the court, silence is often the loudest statement of power. Behind the heavy oak doors, as the balance of authority shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways, the truth became clear to everyone watching closely. The future queen was not waiting for a crown to define her. She was already behaving like a sovereign, her influence sealing the fate of the institution long before the first notes of the coronation anthem would ever be played. In the quiet shift from the old guard to the new, Catherine had become the anchor, leaving the queen consort to drift further into the shadows of a history that was no longer hers to write. The walls of Windsor Castle have stood for nearly 1,000 years, witnessing the rise and fall of dynasties, the whispers of revolution, and the quiet, agonizing decisions of sovereigns who found themselves trapped between the demands of the heart and the requirements of the state. Inside a secluded library, far from the prying eyes of the court and the constant hum of the modern world, King Charles sat alone. The weight of time seemed to press more heavily upon him in these moments of stillness. For decades, he had waited for the crown, believing that when the moment finally arrived, his authority would be absolute, his family united, and his legacy secure. But as he looked out over the sprawling estate, the reality felt far narrower and more unforgiving than he had ever imagined. He was a man caught in the middle of a storm he could no longer control, and the person he relied on most for emotional stability, Queen Camilla, was being systematically erased from the future he was trying to build. The meeting he had called was not a formal state occasion, but it carried the gravity of a declaration of war. When Princess Anne entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. She did not walk with the hesitation of a younger sibling, or the deference of a subject. She walked with the stride of someone who had spent 7 decades preparing for this exact moment of reckoning. There were no warm greetings, no shared memories of their childhood at Clarence House. The silence between them was thick, a physical barrier that Charles found increasingly difficult to penetrate. He had spent several days under the intense pressure of Camilla's fury and her tears. She had described her exclusion from William's coronation planning as a public humiliation, a betrayal that cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. And now, Charles had to confront the architect of that exclusion. The king began to speak, his voice carrying a tremor of emotion that he could not entirely suppress. He did not speak as a monarch issuing a command, but as a husband pleading for the dignity of his wife. He spoke of loyalty, of the 40 years of judgment and scrutiny Camilla had endured to stand by his side. He reminded Anne of the patient work they had done to rebuild the queen consort's image, to move her from the shadows of scandal into the light of public service. "She is my wife," he reportedly said, the words hanging in the air like a desperate plea. It was a declaration of personal devotion, an appeal to the shared history of a family that had survived so much. To Charles, this was about redemption. It was about ensuring that the woman he loved was not cast aside just as they had reached the summit of their journey. But Princess Anne did not come to Windsor to discuss feelings or to offer comfort. She remained standing, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the stone walls around them. Her reply was firm, calm, and devastatingly final. She did not argue against Camilla's character, nor did she deny the work that had been done to rehabilitate her image. Instead, she spoke the language of the institution, a language that Charles, in his emotional distress, seemed to have forgotten. She reminded him that the monarchy does not belong to the individuals who wear the crowns. It belongs to the history that precedes them and the future that must follow them. "He is our future," she said, referring to William. The statement was not just a reminder of the line of succession. It was a cold acknowledgement of where the real power now resided. Anne's argument was structural. She explained that for the monarchy to survive the modern age, the transition to William's reign had to be seen as a clean, untainted progression. Any perceived overreach by a consort, especially one with such a complex history, would only serve to weaken the foundations of the throne at a time when the public's patience was at its thinnest. She told her brother, with a chilling lack of apology, that her loyalty was not to his personal happiness, but to the crown itself. She had seen the way Camilla had begun to shape ceremonial matters, and she had decided, along with the Prince of Wales, that the boundary had to be drawn now, before the precedent became permanent. Charles sat in a long, uneasy silence. The harsher reality was finally sinking in. His influence was no longer what it once was. He had reached the throne only to find that the most significant decisions regarding the future were being made by his sister and his son, often without his direct input. The pageant of contradiction that Anne feared was already beginning to take shape, and she was the only one willing to use the knife to cut it away. He looked at his sister and saw not a sibling, but a guard at the gate, steady and unmoved by his emotional appeals. When the conversation died, there were no efforts at reconciliation. Anne simply gave a brief, respectful nod, a gesture of protocol rather than affection, and walked away. No closing remarks were made to soften the blow. Charles was left in the gathering shadows of the library, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever. He had failed to change her mind because he was fighting for a person, while Anne was fighting for a thousand-year-old idea. In that moment, the king understood a painful truth. Power in the monarchy is borrowed through tradition and protected by those willing to sacrifice everything, even family harmony, to ensure its survival. The meeting ended, and with it, the illusion that Charles could protect Camilla from the rising tide of the next generation. The silent storm had claimed its first major victory, and the king was left to face the consequences alone. In the high-stakes world of royal diplomacy, where every gesture is choreographed and every word is weighed for its historical impact, the most powerful weapons are often those that never leave the shadows. For decades, the public has been fed a diet of carefully curated press releases and staged photographs, but the true history of the firm is written in private. In a stunning turn of events that has left even the most seasoned palace insiders breathless, a private letter written by Princess Anne has surfaced through the most discreet of channels. It was a document never intended for the eyes of the public, or even for the wider royal household. It was a stark, unflinching message from a sister to a king, and its contents cut straight to the bone of the crisis currently consuming the House of Windsor. The letter was written in the quiet hours of a cold Tuesday morning, weeks before the world realized that Queen Camilla had been effectively sidelined from the future. Princess Anne, sitting at her desk at Gatcombe Park, chose to bypass the usual digital security and formal secretaries. She wrote by hand, her script as disciplined and sharp as her personality. This act alone signaled the gravity of her intent. When the Princess Royal takes up a pen, it is not for a casual exchange, it is to issue a decree of conscience. The letter, which eventually made its way into the hands of King Charles, reveals a woman deeply terrified that the institution she has spent 70 years defending is slowly, almost imperceptibly, losing its soul. Anne began the letter by acknowledging the heavy burden of tradition that they both inherited from their mother. She spoke of the crown not as an ornament of prestige, but as a relentless duty that demands the sacrifice of personal desires. However, it was her warning about the present state of the monarchy that carried the most sting. She described the current trajectory of the palace as a slow descent into what she chillingly termed a pageant of contradiction. To Anne, a pageant is a hollow spectacle, a show put on for an audience that lacks the substance of true leadership. She argued that when appearances begin to matter more than purpose, the foundation of the throne begins to rot from within. Though she never mentioned Camilla by name within the 3 pages of the letter, the target of her critique was unmistakable. Anne wrote about the poison of public perception and how the pursuit of media approval had led the monarchy to make compromises that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. She was referencing the decades-long campaign to rehabilitate Camilla's image, a project she viewed as a dangerous distraction from the monarchy's true calling. To Anne, the monarchy does not exist to be liked. It exists to be stable, to be permanent, and to be a symbol of national responsibility that stands above the fickle winds of popular opinion. She warned Charles that by allowing personal relationships to dictate the shape of ceremonial duties, he was risking the one thing the monarchy cannot afford to lose, its mystery and its integrity. The most profound section of the letter focused on the next generation. Anne described Thunvung William as the last strong pillar of the family, a man who managed to combine the ironclad respect for tradition with a necessary vision for the future. Her confidence in William was absolute, but it came with a dark caveat. She warned her brother that if William's path were to be cluttered by the competing interests and overreaching influences of the present, the pillar would eventually crack under the pressure. She urged Charles to see that the future of the crown now rested not on his own reign, which she viewed as a transitional period, but on the strength and clarity of his son's eventual ascension. The letter reached its climax with a demand that was as painful as it was necessary. Anne argued that for the institution to survive, Charles had to be willing to let go. This was not a request for him to abdicate, but a plea for him to step back from the personal battles of his wife and allow the Prince of Wales the space to define the monarchy for the 21st century. She spoke of the loneliness of the crown, a burden their mother had carried with such stoic grace, and reminded him that this loneliness often requires pushing away those closest to you to protect the greater good. Letting go of Camilla's influence in the planning of the future was, in Anne's eyes, the only way to prevent the pageant from turning into a farce. This letter was the blueprint for the surgical exclusion that followed. It provided the moral and strategic justification for William to take his uncompromising stand. When Charles read those words, he wasn't just reading the thoughts of his sister. He was reading the collective anxieties of the old guard and the silent hopes of the new. The letter revealed that the internal war was not about petty jealousy or ancient grudges. It was a desperate struggle to save an ancient idea from the modern world's hunger for celebrity. As the details of this correspondence began to leak into the highest circles of the palace, The reaction was one of stunned silence. No one had expected Anne to be so blunt, so final, but for the Princess Royal, the time for subtlety had passed. She had seen the cracks forming in the palace walls and chose to use her voice to call for a radical realignment. Her message was a cold shower for a king who had spent too long trying to balance his heart and his crown. The survival of the monarchy, she argued, required a sacrifice of the personal for the sake of the eternal. And as the world watches the fallout of Camilla's exile, they are seeing the direct result of a sister's unwavering belief that some things, especially the Vung Mien, are far too important to be shared with anyone who does not truly understand the weight of the bloodline. Anne's letter was the final closing of the door, and in the silence that followed, the future of the British monarchy began to take a much harder, more disciplined shape. The dust may eventually settle over the ancient stones of Windsor and the polished floors of Clarence House, but the institution of the monarchy has been irrevocably changed. What we have witnessed is not merely a family dispute, but a seismic realignment of power that has left Queen Camilla standing in the cold, facing the reality of a quiet exile. Princess Anne's calculated resistance and Prince William's sharp defiance have signaled the end of an era where a consort's influence could bridge the gap between tradition and personal desire. The message from the bloodline is final. The future belongs to those who embody the duty of the crown without compromise. As the planning for the next generation continues behind locked doors, the seat once reserved for Camilla remains empty, a symbolic void that speaks louder than any official statement. William and Catherine have stepped into the light, their partnership forming a new, unbreakable foundation for a monarchy that seeks authenticity over appearance. They are no longer waiting for the crown. They are already defining its moral and ceremonial borders. But we must ask, was Princess Anne's decisive move a necessary act of salvation for the monarchy, or was it a cold-hearted betrayal of a woman who had finally earned her place? Has the firm become too rigid in its pursuit of survival, or is this the only way to ensure the throne remains relevant in the 21st century? The cracks in the palace walls may be hidden from public view, but the internal divide is deep, and the consequences will be felt for decades to come. What do you think about the Princess Royal's actions toward the Queen Consort? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden power struggles of the royal family compelling, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exclusive insights into the world's most famous dynasty. The story is far from over, and we will be here to witness